Good evening, everyone. It is now 5:30, and I will call our special work session to order. And if the clerk would note that all council members are present. For our viewing audience, we have our staff in the room with us, as well as all council members. So this meeting is both in person and online, and people can watch us on burnsvillemn.gov/meetings or Comcast channel 16 or 859. And if the public so wishes, you can participate through Zoom, and more information is available on our meeting webpage and in the council agenda packet. This is a special work session that has to do with our budget, and so I am going to go first to our city manager, Mr. Greg Lindberg, to make a few remarks and then introduce our interim chief financial officer.
Excellent, Madam Mayor. Thank you. Members of the council, thank you for yet another budget meeting this evening. We're looking forward to it. A couple of reminders, both for you and for the community. First, all of this year's budget materials are available directly on our website. There's a landing page, burnsvillemn.gov/budget. That lays out all of the materials, including videos of all of these meetings for the community, as well as slide decks and our budget transparency portals, which are interactive and allow people to kick around, the community to kick around in the current year's budget. Tonight's focus brings us one step closer in what has been a process that started really back in early March when Dan and our partners at Ellers presented you with an initial draft of a new financial management plan, really focused on the 10-year future of our budget and finances. As we continued that conversation, even as recently as July, we presented you with an 8.88% property tax levy increase for 2023, and then offered a scenario that was more related to maintaining the current tax rate. So tonight, with your direction, we're bringing both of those concepts back to you. Pleased to report to you that with the hard work of Dan, the finance team, and everyone around this table on our leadership team, we do have a balanced budget scenario to present to you and talk a little bit more in detail about this evening. As we do that, a couple of reminders, again, both for your benefit and the benefit of the community. By September 30th, the council needs to adopt a max tax. That's the maximum levy that you could implement. And from there, you can always go down. You just can't go up, as a reminder. So it sets the maximum levy. We'll do that on September 20th, your regular city council meeting. And then by December 30th, so on December 6th, we would bring back your final budget and final levy, which is really that one decision that the council makes that impacts folks' property tax savings in the city. With that, tonight Dan's going to walk through a presentation that delivers on what we committed to you back in July. There's plenty of information again. There's a couple of pieces of information in front of you that I'll just point you to real quickly. These will also be available online for the community in one way, shape, or form as we kind of work through the 2023 budget portal. But the first is just a little bit more detail on the tax levy scenarios that we'll be walking through tonight. Just because there's lots of slides and movement electronically, we wanted to have that in front of you. The second might need a little bit more explanation. It is a legal-sized piece of paper that's titled Proposed 2023 Budget Significant Changes and Requests Summary. Really, this is the master document that the leadership team and I have been working through to represent changes to the budget of $25,000 or more, and any sort of requested formal FTE or full-time equivalent employee addition to the budget. This document very much reflects what you've seen through the organizational analysis, and our department director is walking through their service conversations with you. Why I wanted to share this with you this evening is the budget that I'm putting in front of you that's balanced to the scenarios that you'll see tonight includes my approval of the positions that are outlined in this document, and there are also a couple that have not been approved through our process. Again, it's really reflective of my recommendation to you that Dan's going to walk through in terms of the proposed budget. But I wanted to make sure that you had the information in front of you, again, in the spirit of what we committed to in January, full transparency, It's really been my commitment in the organization to make sure that each and every department head as part of our leadership team is both informed and part of the budget process. And this has been one of the ways internally that we've done that. So I wanted you to have this information. I'll also be resharing this in some of my communication to you as we continue to refine and build the budget. So with that, probably in typical Greg fashion, been a little bit more verbose than I should be. The final thing that I would ask of you tonight is we really are looking for your direction based on the recommendations that we're putting in front of you. This work is a cumulative effort on the staff side of things. I'm confident in the recommendation that we're putting in front of you to not only bring your strategic priorities to life, but also really reflective of your vision. And tonight's conversation is about getting some direction for you to prepare for that September 20th max tax decision. So with that, I will turn it to our interim CFO, who needs no other introduction. Dan?
All right. Well, thank you, Manager Lindberg. Since I don't need any introduction, I would introduce Alyssa Ryan, our Deputy CFO. So she is here as backup and to help answer any questions that the council may have as we walk through the presentation this evening.
It's good to have you at the table, Alyssa.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
All right. Well, much like we've talked about in the past, this work session this evening does have a couple goals. The first, as the city manager mentioned, is to continue and to build on the conversations that we've had throughout the year. We did begin back in March, had another meeting in April, and then we also had a conversation in July about the CIP. With all that information and using that guidance, we have prepared what is really the city manager's proposed 2023 budget and the financial plan. And this evening, as Greg mentioned, we are looking for guidance and direction from the council so we may begin preparing for the proposed or maximum property tax levy presentation, which will happen at the second meeting in September. This evening, I'm going to walk through various funds, much like we did with the CIP presentation. But before I do that, I'll touch on some economic expectations. Not to spoil those slides, but there hasn't been a lot of change since we met in July, but just to make sure that everyone's on the same page, I'll walk through them very briefly. We'll talk about the general fund. We'll close with the discussion about the property tax alternatives, which are outlined in the document that was distributed prior to the meeting. And then, as the city manager mentioned, we do have recommendations from staff regarding those alternatives. Just as a reminder about the schedule, we do have a lengthy budget development process this year. We've spent the first portion of the year planning and talking about what the budget would look like, how it should be constructed, and really how it would flow through staff and the council. And then really up until September here, we are in the review stage where we are looking at the budget, making adjustments, hearing recommendations, and eventually folding that into the proposed budget this evening. It is worth noting that one of the significant changes as a part of this year's budget process is we had a series of internal meetings with the city manager wherein every department director was given the opportunity to present and request changes to the budget and advocate for the needs of their various departments. Something we heard after the all-day work session and also debriefing some of the directors is they felt like they lacked a forum to request things through the budget process and then also to advocate for the needs of their particular parts of the organization. So that was a very big part of this budget development process, and there was a lot of effort and energy that was put into that. And then, as the city manager mentioned, later this year, most notably on September 20th, and then on December 6th, the council will be asked to adopt its proposed property tax levy and then its final property tax levy and budget respectively. So moving into economic expectations and our assumptions. First, as the city manager mentioned, we place a lot of emphasis on the strategic priorities. The budget is really the values document and the vehicle through which strategic priorities are actualized, or as Greg put it quite eloquently, how we breathe life into them. And when we review the various budget requests and adjustments, we make sure that they are consistent with the strategic direction of the city council, as well as your stated values and mission. And moving into the economic expectations for the upcoming year, we are seeing really a modest to perhaps slightly negative economic growth planned for 2023. I think everyone has heard some of the rumblings of recession. And there are various economic indicators that would suggest that may happen. There are also various economic indicators that suggest that it would not happen. Most notably, the very robust jobs reports. In the second quarter, the U.S. economy added 1.2 million jobs and another 500,000 jobs, really blowing all analyst expectations out of the water in the last month. So at this point in time, really that is the probably strongest argument that there is not yet a recession or may not even be a recession. But it's something that we need to keep an eye on and be cognizant of as we move through the budget process. One of the reasons I like to go through the economic expectations is really the council, any public organization is not setting and considering its budget and financial decisions in a vacuum. We do know the Fed has increased its rate by 75 basis points to 2.25% to 2.5%. We are anticipating another 75% basis rate hike at their next meeting. Although with the jobs report and some of the economic data being what it is, some financial institutions are suggesting that that rate increase could in fact be 50 basis points rather than 75. We did see in the last round of inflation numbers that inflation did come in a little softer than it did in previous months and also beat some of the expectations. But as you've heard me say many times, there are uncertainty in all of these economic forecasts and a number of things that are impacting those projections. The first, we know for the city in particular, negotiations at the state level regarding state appropriations and tax policies. There is an election on the horizon. It'll be followed by a legislative session at the beginning of the fiscal year of this budget. And we know the state has about $12 to $13 billion to play with, and that could certainly impact some of the financial decisions that happen here at the city. Geopolitical conflicts, that's my fancy jargon for the war in Ukraine and how that impacts some of the things that are happening around the globe as it relates to commodity prices, primarily wheat and fuel. And then we do know there are lingering economic pressures, primarily as it relates to supply chains from COVID-19. The council's seen any number of items come before it recently where we've asked to order things well in advance of when we were planning on ordering them just because of supply chain disruption. So those things are also considered when we're trying to put together this budget document. And then as I mentioned, that increased potential for the recession. So as you've seen in the past, this comes from Wells Fargo Economic Advisors. We use Wells Fargo because they are the primary depository of the city. And you can see in 2023 in that blue box all the way on the right-hand side, a negative 0.4%. That is the current projection, so really what would be a mild economic recession. Two things I would note about that number. One, I think folks have become very accustomed to the fact that recessions, at least in the recent past, have been very kind of deep and have changed some things in terms of how our financial institutions work. But really most recessions, and on average the United States has about one every 6 years, tend to be quite mild. And in fact, if you look at 2020, we're looking at a negative 3.4% growth there. That's about 8 to 9 times what it is that we would be expecting in terms of recessionary pressures. And then as you can see below with the federal funds rate target, anticipating that there would be an increase in the federal funds rate to combat inflation and the resulting economic recession. But many financial institutions, Wells Fargo included, are assuming that there would actually be a reduction in the rate perhaps in late 2023. So meaning then that the Fed's goal is always trying to get back to neutral, is to have a rate that neither stimulates or reduces economic activity. And so there are some folks that are thinking at the end of 2023 that the Fed could actually cut rates. So we'll have to kind of wait and see. Obviously, nobody has a crystal ball, but this is the best guess given the really immense, sometimes overwhelming, paralyzing amount of data that exists about economic activity. Speaking of paralyzing things, so
Yeah.
Don't change your channel, it's not your business.
And if you're
Yeah.
colorblind,
The
we
signal is
apologize.
correct, that's right.
we are
Wow.
You're just trying to confuse us now.
What is that?
certainly not.
You did.
Certainly not. Really what I was trying to do is find a slide that had a bit of parsimony in it as far as what is happening in the economy. Wells Fargo has this excellent recession monitor, and as you can see across the top, it monitors really 4 of the main indicators that indicate whether or not a recession is taking place. Non-farm employment, or just the normal unemployment that, or employment or unemployment that you hear about, incomes, sales, and then industrial production. Industrial production is often considered a leading indicator, strong leading indicator. As you can see in this chart, what they've done is they've combined all of them into one easy to read graph. The gray that's shaded are really the periods of economic recession. So you can see really the turn of the millennium and the dot-com, the housing recession, and then the really tiny strip of gray that reflects the pandemic. The thing to keep in mind in each of these areas, and you can really see it visually as far as the depth of the chart, is the country really only enters recession when 3 or 4 of these indicators are all negative or trending negative. And at this point in time, there was really
okay.
only one. And so the economic data at this point in time would suggest that there may not be a recession, and then if there even is a recession, as indicated by the previous slide, it would be relatively mild. Again, really bolstered by the incredibly strong labor market at this point in time. And I think it's worth noting that generally, we have not seen a recession when the labor market is this strong. So the economy is doing sometimes what it does, sending some mixed and confusing signals, and as, of course, 23 becomes more proximate, we'll have more information about what to expect. But right now, generally, I would say that the economic indicators look okay for next year.
Okay.
And I will never show you that chart again, I promise.
But very good explanation.
I did appreciate eyes
Yeah.
on the pies like that.
Yeah,
Thank your friends at Wells Fargo.
There you go.
yeah.
So, some other assumptions that we're making, again, what the city is up to with the American Rescue Plan Act monies, those have all been allocated to the general fund. And then we do have some additional fund balance requirements that we've talked about in the past, primarily as it relates to the general fund this evening. It's worth noting, when we formed all of our property tax alternatives, they were all informed by that 40% budgeted expenditures for the subsequent year. Meaning that when we were making those property tax adjustments, we were making sure that we were consistent with the council's guidance. And by way of preview, I can say that they really do not dip below about 43%. We were planning a scenario where there was always a little bit of cushion between what was being recommended and what the council has identified as being the lowest possible fund balance level in that 40%. But really, we were aiming for 43%. We funded all the capital projects, and then, as we've talked in the past, a lot of these assumptions reflect significant inflationary pressures. So some selected assumptions from the various parts of the budget. And expenditures, we're assuming 3% on salaries and wages. We had a rate lock when it came to health insurance premiums, so those were set at 5%. That was actually a little bit of a savings compared to our previous assumptions. We were assuming 10%, but our friends in HR let us know that we had a rate lock. And then workers' compensation insurance premiums, 10%. That's based on feedback that we received from the League of Minnesota Cities Insurance Trust. And then current expenditures, we did offer a 2% change that was essentially in deference to the ask on the FTEs and personnel services as related to the general fund. And then on the revenue side, 8.88%. I just rounded it off to 8.9. 2.5% on fees and charges. We did make a standard adjustment this year. In the past with the fee schedule, and I should say that in the next few weeks, the council will be provided with the draft fee schedule. But essentially what we've done is, rather than ask all of the departments to justify any rate increases as it relates to their fees and charges, the city manager basically provided direction to all the departments saying that any discretionary fee should go up by 3%. Basically ensuring that as those fees are related, there are inflationary pressures that come to bear on them, and we want to make sure that those fees remain consistent with those inflationary tracks. Otherwise, what ends up happening is your fees remain low and your costs go up.
Yeah.
And then what picks up the difference is the property tax levy.
Yeah, yeah.
So what we're trying to do is make sure that all of the various stakeholders that pay fees in the cities or pay taxes are all experiencing the kind of same growth and costs that the city has to experience. It's worth noting that anything that is controlled by statute or ordinance, or that we know the council has taken a particular interest in the past, let's say fees that relates to the licensing of alcohol, were not adjusted. So we have looked in to see what was happening as far as council guidance in the past. But generally, it was designed to make sure that some of those fees, in some cases that hadn't been adjusted for years, were keeping up with some of the costs that existed in the organization.
I think it's worth a reminder that you will see in detail, council, the fee schedule and any sort of notes and changes in kind of a redlined box grid version. We're working on pulling that together for you, so you'll be able to take some time to review that. Certainly ask any questions that you might have, but in general, great summary, Dan, of how we've approached that schedule for the 2023 budget.
Okay, good.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, I would also add to Greg's comments that we are going to change a little how it is marked up. One of the things that Greg has given direction to the finance department on is making it easier to understand when the document goes to the council about what is changing and why. And so we're gonna look at that and get you something that is a little easier for you to work with from a policy perspective.
Much appreciated.
Investment earnings, at this point in time, we're assuming 1.8%, and I'll talk a little bit more about investment earnings in a slide or two. And then we just adjusted all their non-property tax revenues by about 1%, which is a fairly conservative number. I won't dwell on this slide for too long. You've seen it many, many, many times, but it's just a reminder about some of the things that are out there that either have recently landed or are still waiting to land. The big one is the fleet study, which you'll be talking about in October. And then, of course, all 5 of the city's labor agreements are still outstanding, and so the council will have to take action on them at some point in time in the future. Of course, with personnel services being a great portion of the general fund budget, and most staff in the city assigned to a good portion of that to the general fund, any change in those labor agreements versus what are in the assumptions could change kind of what the overall budget looks like. So in the past, we had not yet had the time to walk through some of the special revenue funds and a couple of the enterprise funds. So before we get into the general fund, I thought I would just touch on a few of them. The first is the golf course fund, and I should say before I get into all of them, a lot of these recommendations really mimic what the council heard at the financial management plan discussion, but we did go back through and look through the data, review requests from the individual departments, and then made adjustments accordingly. So as you can see here with the golf course fund, the main change is we are recommending a 6% increase in the rates and charges for next year, followed by a 4% increase every year through the out years. That's primarily to support planned capital outlays in the fund. It really needs about $59,000 annually based on its average capital outlay over the past 5 years. And so the rate changes were really designed to make sure that the fund had a sufficient amount of money to at least meet those average outlays over the past so many years. But as you know, it's worth noting that the fund is not totally self-sufficient. And in fact, over the period that's represented on the slide, there's about another $420,000 in capital outlay that's planned for the golf course that will be supported by the facilities fund. Moving on to the ice center, right now we're assuming a 2% increase in charges for service annually. The one thing I would note, and you can see there's a significant spend down that does occur over the 5-year planning window. It does remain above the cash requirement balance, but if we were to extend the analysis out another few years, it does start to dip below it, primarily due to the capital outlays that are required by the fund. And we do know that over the 6 years that are represented here on the slide, there are about $2 million in capital outlays that would have to be supported by the facilities fund. So again, much like the golf course, and consistent with the council's past practice with these funds, many of the more extraordinary capital costs are not supported or borne by the fund itself. Those monies come from the from the facilities fund. The Ames Center, again, very similar to what the council saw at the financial management plan presentation. We are still assuming those same changes in charges for services. There is still another significant spend down over the 5 years. And again, it would go below once you get past the 2027 timeline. It's worth noting one of the big drivers for this is there are no more transfers from the general fund to support the Ames Center. And much like the other funds, it excludes about $2.3 million in capital outlays. Those would be supported again. Not sound like a broken record by the facilities fund.
So, I'm sorry, what was the percent increase?
Right now, if I recall correctly, we're assuming a 2% increase year over year.
Coming off a 16.5% increase.
Moving into the forestry fund, this one is, I would say, generally on autopilot in terms of its costs and its revenues. But as you can see, over the planning period, there is a significant spend down, and the ending fund balance does go down, and eventually does run out, but it does take many, many, many years. So this fund is in a very strong position. The one thing that staff is recommending that would be a deviation from past practices is to start adjusting the levy for this fund by 3% annually. It is a relatively small levy, but generally, much like we talked about before, we're trying to make sure that the revenues raised by this fund are not eroded by inflationary pressures. And meaning that at some point in time in the future, the council would not have to make significant changes or identify alternative revenue sources to support the fund. It's possible at some point in time in the future there could be 10 or 20% increases, but much like we talked about with the IT Capital Projects Fund, it's a relatively small portion of the overall levy, and so the overall impact wouldn't be that great. But since it does have a fairly healthy ending fund balance year over year, a modest change in the levy over time should make for quite a course correction later in the fund's life. So the Economic Development Authority Fund, this is also consistent with the recommendations from the Financial Management Plan. As I joked with Craig this morning, this is my rocket ship to the moon, apparently. Right now, we are assuming a $702,500 increase in the property tax levy in 2023. It's part of a multi-year strategy, basically to get to the statutory maximum. So another $250,000 the year after, another $250,000 the year after, and then finally in 2026, another $332,600. That basically brings the levy to just right around $1.8 million. Again, that levy is a function, or the statutory maximum, I should say, is a function of the market value of the entire community. So once it gets up to the 1.8 million, really the year-over-year increases are relatively small unless there is a large increase in the estimated market value of the community. As we've talked in the past, these additional funds would be designed to support already identified EDA strategic priorities and goals as it relates to the EDA strategic plan. So things like Heart of the City, promoting the community as a regional destination, and the housing strategy plan goals. These include things like the residential lending programs, and also energy efficiency initiatives. It's also worth noting that some of the monies could be used for the commercial rehabilitation loan program. The council actually has an adopted policy related to that program, but there are no funds as of yet appropriated to it. So making good on many of the plans, goals, and in some cases, very substantive actions in the way of the policies that were adopted in funding them. I would also add that these monies would help the council and the EDA better influence and participate in the redevelopment activities in the community. You may recall there was at one point in time when Burnsville Center was for sale for $17 million, and there was some questions about how the city could become involved and what the city could do. And really at that point in time, there was not a war chest. There was not money to participate or to control any of the destinies of these redevelopment sites. I'd also note that EDA funds are often used to remove and address blight, and they also really what they're designed to do is support the property tax base. So it's how you can help maintain all those single-family homes, how you can provide assistance to businesses who may need a new facade or want some monies to create additional jobs in the community. Really, it's all about protecting, enhancing, and growing the property tax base through programs that the council deems appropriate. And as I mentioned, you've done a lot of this work. You've done a lot of economic development planning. You may recall at the previous presentation, we walked through about 20 to 30 years of economic development planning, and now the recommendation here this evening is to bring the financial resources to bear to make all of those plans a reality. The one thing that I would mention, and this was just one of my favorite stats from the previous presentation, when we looked through the peer communities, right now, based on audited financial statements, St. Louis Park has about 33 times the financial resources than Burnsville specifically dedicated for economic development purposes. So they have some $20+ million available and a maxed out levy. I make mention of it because during our discussion at the all-day work session, there was a lot of chat about the West End and what that looks like and whether or not things like that could happen here in Burnsville in some way, shape, or form, and they certainly can. But as demonstrated by some of the financial decisions they've made and the city's interaction with those sites, these are the things that end up happening to facilitate those types of developments.
If I may?
Yeah.
2 questions. So number one, could you explain the difference between St. Louis Park as a community and Burnsville as far as our demographics and our property values? Number two, what is the percentage increases that you're looking at for the EDA?
Madam Mayor, members of the council, so for the year-over-year increase, if I recall correctly, for the $702,500 for next year, I believe is 234%. As far as the demographic breakdowns and the housing values between St. Louis Park and Burnsville, I would have to report back to the council on that. I don't have those figures available at my fingertips. To be perfectly honest, I just picked on that one because that was a community that the council had talked about during previous work sessions.
They also came and presented to us when we looked at different communities and what they were doing with their EDA. And St. Louis Park was one of those communities that came in and presented.
Yeah, they absolutely are. And I do not know the percent difference, but I do know one of the things that Burnsville has is we have affordable housing stock.
Yeah.
And we also have very affordable commercial properties as well, especially compared to other cities. So that can have a little difference in what your community can bear.
Yeah.
So I'm just pointing that out. So, and just to clarify, so we're looking at an increase in the EDA levy of 234%. Did I hear that correctly?
Madam Mayor, members of the council, I believe that's what it is. There is a
Okay.
slide later in the presentation that will have
I
the specific
jumped
number.
the gun. Thank you.
I'm just
Appreciate it.
working off my memory.
I think although St. Louis Park at one time, I don't know what the census came out with recently, but they were a city of 42,000.
Yeah.
We were a city of
They're much
60,000.
smaller than us.
So we were much larger than they are.
Yeah. Yeah, and also we're 27 square miles, and I think that they're, do you remember?
I do not remember, Madam Mayor.
Uh-oh, shame,
You know,
shame.
My Burnsville
He's
facts are far
focused
more
on
important.
Burnsville.
Yeah.
Oh, good save.
Okay, good, okay, nice save. Yeah,
I will say, in all seriousness, though, Councilmember Schultz, we certainly can provide some additional comparative response
Yeah.
back to you and the council. I think that's only fair. I think it's also worth noting that there are other anecdotal comparisons that we could make, be it other communities or St. Louis Park in general, particularly with Burnsville's. I'll pick on the example of natural occurring affordable housing. Certainly an important priority in both our single and multifamily housing stock. Similarly, St. Louis Park has made a very bold commitment to their natural occurring affordable housing through
Yeah.
through programs that are frankly funded
Yeah.
through their EDA and their HRA. In fairness, so I think those comparisons are important as we kind of talk about what do we want the community development, economic development future of Burnsville to be. And right now, the assumption that we've made in the proposed budget here is what you saw in the financial management plan in terms of stepping up the investment to the EDA. Dan had stopped into my office an hour or so ago and encouraged me to make sure that I voiced an opinion in place of a currently vacant community development director position as part of the leadership team. And I do think that I would be remiss not to at least suggest or underscore some of what Dan has presented here, particularly in, this is a significant investment, and I don't take that lightly, but it has been the one single most question that has been asked by any candidate who we're interested in. The leadership team is interested in talking to further about our vacant position and the future of economic development, particularly in Burnsville. So it's something that's garnering the attention of the professional experts that we're currently talking with in our selection process. And I think that's just an important point is you consider my recommendation, our staff recommendation on this particular item and others and Dan said it more eloquently, but really at the end of the day, this is a decision to invest in our future tax base. And to your questions and to the dialogue of the council, from my perspective, it really becomes the policy choice of the council, what that future should look like. And that's the lever that you all have to pull here in terms of the direction that you give us on this particular fund.
10.85 square miles.
pardon me?
St. Louis Park is 10.85 square miles.
Yeah.
It's about
And
a
it's
little more than
about
a third the size of Burnsville.
48,000 people in population, so we're much larger.
Yeah, I think I just drove past the sign on Highway 100
Yeah.
today, actually, and saw that they had changed it to 51-some thousand. So that was surprising to me.
Oh, okay, so since the
Go figure.
census.
Very dense in
So that must be
Levy.
since
It
the
is very
census.
dense.
Very dense.
Yeah,
And that has been, I think, again, to the comparison questions, that's been part of the priority of that council and community, right? So those comparisons get difficult,
Yeah.
to Councilmember Schultz's earlier point.
And I think going back to 1995, 96, St. Louis Park and Burnsville were going in the same direction of redevelopment. And they were doing Grand Avenue, and we were doing the heart of the city. So they were investing money and starting to build a war chest in their EDA, and we didn't. Yeah, so. And the former city manager of St. Louis Park lives in Burnsville.
And I can guarantee you, after he sees this conversation, he'll be
He is
reaching out
going
to
to
me.
be emailing us and educating us.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So moving on to the general fund. This is my favorite definition in perhaps all of public finance. The general fund accounts for everything not accounted for in another fund. That's why we call it the general fund, is because we can't find a more specific place to put it. So just a reminder for the council and the community, it really supports all of the operating activities of the city. So administration, fire, parks, police, what have you. For the proposed 2023 budget, I'll just touch on a few highlights. Property taxes at this point in time, it's a 13.5% increase that's being recommended for the fund. That's compared to 2022. It's a 10.2% if you were to compare it overall. I know at a previous meeting there was some discussion about that component of the levy and the percent change, and then that part of the levy against the overall levy. So I have a slide later in the presentation that kind of walks through all of that. Charges for service, we're assuming a 5% increase. Again, that includes the 3% standard adjustment that I talked about before. Also an adjustment based on the historical amount that we were seeing in charges. Perhaps the standout right now is investment income. We actually went through a more complicated process to assign investment incomes to funds. This increase reflects two things. One, the pending decision by the council. There'll be a recommendation at a future meeting to engage a money manager. We've been talking with Ellers, and they've given us some information about how they could maximize performance and yield in the portfolio, but then also the increasing interest rate environment. So right now, we're recognizing about $156,000 in additional investment earnings in 2023. And then, as I mentioned in a previous slide, transfers in $3 million from the grant fund. Those are the American Rescue Plan Act monies, and that's a $1 million increase compared to 2022. So here is the rolled up general fund revenues. Without further ado, a total of $50,929,448. It's worth noting that that is an increase of about $6,080,200, or about 14% compared to the previous year. And as you will note in the slide, about 68% of all of the revenues of the city come from property taxes. And most of that increase can be attributable to the increase in the property tax levy that flows to the fund. Moving on to expenditures. As the city manager shared in the past, 75% really of all the general fund activities support the people and staff of the organization. And the rest, or about a quarter, comes from current expenditures, and then there are some transfers for lodging tax, and then also just to other funds that also flow from the general fund. In total, $51,088,892 of general fund expenditures planned for the proposed 2023 budget. That would be an increase of about $5,030,800, or 11% compared to the previous year. And in case you were wondering what makes up those differences, I've done some math for you. As you can see here, personnel services, the change in the compensation plan, or basically that 3% adjustment to wages and salaries, makes up about $1.2 million. The organizational analysis implementation, or the additional staff, right around $2.4 million. The increase in the health insurance premiums from the aforementioned rate lock, right around $640,000. And then the larger than usual increase in workers' compensation insurance premiums, right around $391,000. Down below, under current expenditures, you can see the inflation adjustment that has occurred. This is based both on what it is we have heard from departments about what they need to accomplish the ordinary business of the city, and then also the additional inflationary pressures that we granted them in the planning of the budget process. One thing that's worth calling out, that our friends in Fleet would be quite happy about is we are making sure that we are making adjustments to fuel based on the cost of fuel that we've seen in the marketplace. That has come down a little bit since this number was originally put together, so it's possible that between now and the final budget that this number could be a little different. But we'll have to wait and see and kind of track what is happening with fuel prices generally. And then down below, you do see transfers out. Those numbers have actually gone down. That is a function of the fact that the city does not have in its general fund as much money to accomplish certain one-time projects. So things in the previous year, like radios, what would happen is we would have an outlay in the general fund, it would be transferred to the equipment fund, and then the equipment fund would expend those monies. Those transfers aren't happening right now, so you're seeing that reduction. There still are some transfers that occur, primarily to support street projects, maintenance activities. $385,000 makes up the lion's share of those transfers out. So as you can see, that makes up the $5,030,800, or the 11% that I mentioned on the previous slide. The one thing that I would note that is not reflected in the slide is we did make an adjustment to the cable franchise fund. We had shared in the past with the council and with the staff that we do know that cable franchise fees have generally remained flat and are likely going to trend down because of the cable cutting phenomena. Since that fund actually supports a number of FTEs, we've moved a number, or reallocated, I should say, the cost of those FTEs from the cable franchise fund into the general fund. We've also transferred money from the cable franchise fund into the general fund to defray some of that costs. So to put some numbers on that for you, about $732,700 was reallocated from the cable franchise fund. That is offset by transfers of $335,000, which basically means that there's a net cost to the general fund of just under $400,000, $397,000. But primarily that was done because of those reductions in revenues over time. The fund would essentially be insolvent. There's a structural imbalance that had to be addressed in order to support those regular activities. So that is also factored in to the recommendations and the expenditures that are included this evening.
Yeah, Dan?
Do you have a guesstimate of when those funds are going to disappear on us?
Ma'am, members of the council, at this point in time, I wouldn't say
Yeah.
that they would disappear. I think the trend, and
Yeah.
depending on the community you look at, we really see them kind of falling off at a
They're
4
losing
to 11%
subscription.
rate. But we would imagine there would be some kind of floor to that it wouldn't necessarily go to zero. And these budget adjustments included in the proposed 2023 budget should protect the solvency of the fund over time. But it is possible that we will have to examine some other alternatives in the future if it turns out that it is lower than anticipated. But I would say for right now, for the 5-year planning window, the fund is in a decent shape, but for potentially some capital projects that may be related to the replacement of some audiovisual and television technologies.
Greg?
I think the important summary version of this conversation is the proposed budget in front of you addresses the conversation from as long ago as last year's discussion about the 2022 budget, which we had identified the need to build a sustainable plan forward with this fund, and it really accomplishes that through to the credit of Alyssa in our finance department, as well as Carissa and her team. Kind of rolling up their sleeves and looking at those trends, Councilmember Gustafson, to your question, but also really building what I would say is both a responsible and a resilient plan forward to ensure that our communications operation is appropriately funded in the right place. And really, summary version, that's what this plan puts us on the path of accomplishing, while trying to be reasonable about, we still anticipate there will be some revenue into the cable franchise for the foreseeable future. But this better aligns us and positions us to manage the operation in a more resilient way into the future.
Yeah, and you can read the articles with regard to Comcast and other cable company, and yet, especially with Comcast, they're losing a lot of subscriptions.
It's all going to streaming.
Yeah,
One more comment, just a bit more broadly before Dan moves on. This slide really was intended to address some questions that came up in our July work session, I believe, Councilmember Keeley, you had asked some specific questions about what made up the delta or the gap, that $5 million that's shown on the last line here. This is our best attempt at really representing the sum and substance of the challenges that the general fund faces, and trying to quantify the investment in a way that might be a bit more palatable to understand that gap.
Good. No problems with it.
Moving on, so you may recall, and we've talked about at some length, the organizational analysis and some of the adjustments, as you see here. This reflects the legal size document, that significant changes and request summary, really in a more summarized form by department. You can see in the left-hand column all of the current FTEs that exist in the organization, the proposed or 19 FTEs that would be added through the recommendations this evening, for a total of 307.5 FTEs. And just by comparison to the organizational analysis originally contemplated for this year were 17 FTEs. The 2 additional are in the city manager's office and the finance department. I would also note, for the council's benefit, we are talking about it in the guise of general fund expenditures, and while many of these FTEs are supported, usually to the tune of 2/3 to 80% supported by the general fund, a lot of them are also supported by enterprise funds, primarily the water and sewer fund. And in fact, in the case of public works, those 2 FTEs are supported entirely by enterprise funds. But
So 15 are levy hit, or levy supported?
Yeah.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, I would say right now it would essentially be 17, because we know for sure that those public works staff members would be supported by the enterprise funds, and then the rest of them have allocations based on their activities.
So portions of them, of some of them would be general
Yeah,
fund.
sorry, I was looking at the far column, the OA proposal.
Yep.
So, and deducted 2 from this, that number, sorry.
Another thing that the finance department took some time to take a look at was, were there areas of the budget where essentially budget authority could be identified and reallocated to support the recommendations of the organizational analysis and also to respond to inflationary pressures? Or put another way, were there any areas where there were essentially unspent monies and those monies could be redirected? So with the help of Alyssa, we looked through a number of years of the previous audited financial statements and identified where there were savings. And then we also made some adjustments in 2020 because there were more savings in 2020 than typical years, and that was primarily because of underspending as it related to activities and events that were canceled or delayed or what have you as a result of the pandemic. Then what we did, in an effort to be conservative, is we took 30% of that amount. So essentially, we've plugged into the general fund budget about $234,000 of what we've termed our anticipated budget savings. We've also programmed them for the financial plan and essentially reduced budgeted need by about $1.2 million over the 5-year period. So we have essentially said there is some amount of money that remains unspent at the end of every year. We do know, because of variability that exists in city operations, we can't take it all. And we know that we have a good historical information, so with that information, we just took 30% of that. It's possible that this number could change over time as the city becomes more comfortable with using this type of mechanism, as the data becomes more robust, as we remove some of the outliers that exist because of COVID-19. But really, because of this kind of first crack at it, we decided to take a little more conservative approach. But ultimately, because of this effort, we have identified about $1.2 million in savings over the 5-year period. So something that is certainly meaningful to the budget itself. The one thing I would note, and this is, as I've joked with the city manager, it's a little bit of budget voodoo. But what we essentially do is we leave the departments whole. We have to assume, from a budget perspective, that, for example, the police department always has all of its police officers, and all those police officers have to be paid throughout the entire year. So what we've done here to recognize this anticipated savings is we've created a new or we've renamed an existing department, I should say, that's called citywide, and we've put the anticipated savings as a negative number in citywide. It's just an approximation, but when we look at individual departments, and as you can see from the data here, we know there's turnover in FTEs, and those wages aren't being paid while they're recruiting. We know that certain line items go unspent because it turns out the department didn't need that much professional services that year. But we know they're planning for certain activities and a certain complement of FTEs. So we're not trying to really take anything away from them per se, but make an adjustment in the budget that reflects the reality that there will be savings. So I know that's a lot of moving parts. I'd be happy to answer any questions about it, but I really want to make sure that the council has an understanding of how it is that we've come to this budget savings and how it is we've calculated it and how we'll think about it kind of moving forward. But
Okay.
I think it's a good adjustment, and it has, as you can see, really helped us pay for additional FTEs.
Dan G.
Do you have a cost of recruiting and training built into this when we have to replace people, and what that costs us as far as FTEs in different areas of the city?
And Mayor, members of the council, yes. So I'll answer this question in kind of two thrusts. The first is, we've added some additional HR staff to help with that exact process, primarily as it relates to normal turnover and then the additional FTEs that are being contemplated as part of the budget. As a part of any budget request, we include an assumption, what we call indirect costs, meaning things like electricity, but then also stuff like onboarding costs as it relates to new FTEs. That number is just an approximation. It's a percentage of the salary of the FTE when we add it, and it tends to float between kind of $3,000 and $5,000.
How much?
$3,000 to $5,000.
Okay, thank you.
But it's for kind of all the things that the FTE may impact. It's not necessarily just assigned to one thing or another, but we do include it in the budget.
Okay, yeah. Dan Gay.
Well, I appreciate you pulling this out. Many years ago, in budget discussions, it became obvious that we had this accruing unspent budget funds. And it was accruing because every year there was a budget. City Hall did a great job of staying in budget or under budget. And so we continued to see ourselves tax at one level and spend at a slightly lower level, and then find reasons to spend that additional. And I remember making the case, why don't we just sharpen our pencil a little bit more and stop, taxing a little more than what we really needed. And it's an uncomfortable thing to do, to say, well, I'm going to then just shave 2% or whatever, right? Because everyone works in their best effort and good faith of trying to hit a number that's within the policy guidelines, and every department participates in that. But as you can see, I mean, this is a chart that's almost identical to the one that we looked at, if you go back about 8 or 10 years. The one that was pulled up at that time, going back several years, looked exactly like this one. And so it's just the way it is. What I really wanted to cite is, I really like your idea of, instead of going to each department and saying, shave X 0.5% or whatever it is out of your budget, you're plugging it in as a negative, and it really truly is, that number is the culmination of every single department and every single revenue and expenditure throughout the entire city over an entire year. So really the number, although it looks big, and it may look big to taxpayers, we're a $100 million organization, and we're talking about an average of 370,000. And so it's significant because that equates to a levy, but I really appreciate you bringing this up and the way that you're actually plugging it in to help show that we're probably going to continue to fall within, under budget, as we have for 16 years now, because I've never seen a single year where we actually went over budget or spent even close to budget. It's always been at least around 200 to 400,000, that was saved against the planned, budget. And so I think this is a good exercise for us to go through. I think it's a good discussion to have and to point out. It does also reflect good financial management by the city. every department generally comes in at or below budget, and that's a good thing. But we don't want to have surprises after we've set a budget and ask for forgiveness.
Councilmember
Yeah.
Keeley, you make a good point that the budget, to steal one of Dan's lines, is a team sport. And one of the reasons that the proposed budget includes this analysis and ultimately the offset fund, certainly I can take no credit for it. It was Dan and his team in finance that suggested the mechanism. What it does do is encourage the same effective behavior across our department directors. Each and every person sitting around this table and those who aren't here for various reasons this evening do a very good job effectively managing their budgets. I would never suggest otherwise. And to your point, with $100+ million total budget and with the general fund budget of the size that we're talking about, although the average here is real money, without a doubt, to anyone. It is a relatively small percentage. But what this does do is what the mechanism does is encourage our department directors to continue to manage and lead their budgets well as they have been, while at the same time recognizing that to be honest and fair with our community, that we know that there will be some delta, and we can manage that delta in the budget in a responsible way without putting ourselves and the community in the dilemma where we are overspent, which would be the last case scenario that I would prefer. So I think the recommendation here finds a balance to the conversation that I know that has happened for years around this table, and it is a slightly different approach. I can't call it completely unique. There are other agencies who do this very thing. But it does address the issue that's been discussed for a number of years, while continuing to encourage the folks who are responsible for our operations, primarily our leadership team, to continue to behave in really strong and responsible ways on behalf of the community.
Looks like the math
Yeah.
comes out to about just shy of 0.4%, a little less, just a hair less than 0.5% of our, and I just used 100 million, it's probably a little bit less than that because the budget's a little bit bigger than that, but that's pretty good considering the size, the complexity, the diversity of our city, our functions, our budget, to come in at less than 0.4, 0.4 of a point. Right? That's pretty good performance.
Yeah, especially when you're saying $100 million dollar budget, but when you're looking at what we're levying and making sure that we have a viable organization that continues to deliver, and that we have great leadership in all of the departments that are doing what they're doing and behaving, as Greg puts it, in the way that they do to manage the financial resources of each department, and making sure that our residents understand that we're delivering good service at the cost that we're offering.
Mayor, to your point, I also believe that it encourages, again, the budget is a reflection of your strategic priorities. It's the single largest, the single most important vote and decision that you'll make, reflective of the commitments that you have to the community. And from my perspective, what this mechanism allows us to do, or prevents from happening operationally, which I think would be to a detriment of our commitment to organizational culture, as an example, where we're saying that as an employer of choice, we're going to create the type of environment where people have great experiences, so we create great experiences in the community. One of the first things that would happen if I went to our very competent leadership team is they don't have a lot of discretionary line items in their budgets. So if I were to ask them to cut by 1% their expenditures, my fear would be that the natural inclination would be, well, what can go first?
Yeah.
Here's the training line item, or here's what we're expecting for turnover or cost of onboarding. Frankly, from my perspective, I think that those choices, or putting our leaders in a place to make those choices, would not be congruent with our strategic priorities, and frankly put us in a more costly place in the future, right? Said another way, we're trying to solve for some staffing issues right now in some fairly significant numbers. I would be concerned that activity would be to the detriment of what we're trying to accomplish on the flip side of that. So it really does keep our leaders in a position where they can maintain whole budgets and plan accordingly, but we also recognize that there will be there will inevitably be budget savings that somehow we could realize in the general fund.
Dan T?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So, with all of those factors and adjustments and included, really here is the 5-year general fund, as you will notice, and I should have stressed earlier, all of these numbers really assume that alternative 1 that is listed on your document that was provided before the meeting. By 2027, the general fund revenues will increase to about $64,251,000, and expenditures will increase to about $62,491,000. I would note, as the city manager mentioned, because of the organizational analysis, the 5-year financial plan assumes on average about $1.3 million for additional FTEs through 2026. And as I indicated in an earlier slide, right now, because of the adjustments and the contributions to fund balance that exist over time, and the real goal to try to hit a 43% general fund balance requirement, there is not any more money in the general fund for one-time outlays. Your policy really says it has to be above 45%. Right now, by the end of the 5 years, we're right around 43%. This is to essentially maintain appropriate fund balances, but as we've talked about earlier, not to have overly large fund balances, but still protect things like the financial position of the city, the credit rating of the city, et cetera. So all of that is essentially baked into this presentation in the graph here this evening, and why you see that orange line and that black line floating so closely together.
I think there's an important point to underscore, Mayor, council members, there, that this is both an efficient and an effective proposal when you consider your fund balance policy vis-a-vis things like your credit rating. We are in a strong and stable position. What the proposed budget in front of you does not include is really any sort of flexibility to use fund balance for one-time expenditures that are not emergency situations. So we're managing tightly to that policy.
Okay.
All right. Moving on to the property tax levy. Just by way of reminder, at the previous work session on the 19th, staff presented really 2 property tax levy options. One was to support the organizational analysis, and the other was a discussion of maintenance of the property tax rate. During that time, the council essentially provided guidance to staff to go ahead and explore that second option and report back at this meeting. I did a little look back, and just for the council's benefit, you can see from our previous meetings when we did the FMP review, the update, and the CIP review, we've been diligently working to get the 2023 down, so you see the 10.9, 10, and 8.9. And then the out years change a little bit depending on where we have to pick up additional revenues to meet things like FTE requirements, fund balance requirements, et cetera. But generally, as you can see, we've been around the 9 to 10% throughout the entire year, again, reflecting the council's strategic direction, strategic priorities, and what has been previewed to or talked about with the council about the organizational analysis. So we came up with essentially 3 alternatives for the council to consider based on the guidance received to date. I should note, Vince, I managed with alternative 2 and 3 really to birth twins, I think. And the one thing that I would stress is that each alternative really only adjusts the tax revenue projections. So when you look through these numbers, we're talking about revenue figures. Everything that we talked about previously as it relates to expenditures essentially remains the same. So it's implementation of the organizational analysis, and then it's a question of what is the best way to fund that from a property tax scenario. Before I get into that, I do just want to spend a little time just reminding the council staff and anyone watching that the city has experienced an expansion in its estimated market values over the past year. This is the conversation that essentially spurred the discussion about the property tax rate. There's been about a 14.1% increase in the estimated market value of the community, and we know that the median valued home will be about $341,000, or about a $49,000 increase, which works out to about a 16% increase compared to the previous year. That's also reflected in the taxable market value of the community. Again, it will total about $110,500,000. That's an increase of right around $13.7 million or 14.2%. And this is really the, all of the properties that are subject to tax within the organization. That then translates into the city's net tax capacity. And this is the part of the property tax formula that ultimately determines how much property tax is paid by an individual parcel. And between 2022 and 2023, the net tax capacity increased about $14 million or 16.7%. It's worth noting that between this meeting and our previous meeting, we actually received updated numbers from Dakota County, and all of these numbers went up slightly. Also, the fiscal disparities amounts changed to the benefit of the city of Burnsville ever so slightly.
Good thing we're all sitting down.
Yeah, and anything that goes in the right direction for us
right.
is good.
Well, certainly don't want to overstate it, but I want to be transparent about the data that we're working with and the information that we're using to arrive at these figures. The reason I mention it is because based on the property tax alternatives that we'll preview here with you in a moment, we did not match the rate because we had talked very specifically about 14.5. If we matched the rate perfectly, it would have went to about 15.2. So we stuck with the 14.5. We had to make a decision at the time about what made the most sense to present to the council. And we had talked, I think, more specifically about 14.5 than we did about the rate out to the 1,000th decimal place. So I know, I feel slightly ridiculous saying it out loud too, but I just want to be very clear. So property tax alternative 1, this is what we've termed the organizational analysis implementation. This is very similar to what the council has seen at the previous presentation on the 19th. Essentially, what this would accomplish would be an 8.88% increase, and that would be designed to support the organizational analysis as proposed this evening, those 19 FTEs that we talked about on the previous slide. One thing that I would note, and we talked about earlier, and you can just see, I presented the year-over-year changes in 2 different ways. One, compared to the previous year, which is that 13.5%, and the other compared to the total, which is the presentation that the council is most familiar with, which is that 10.17 or 10.2%. But overall, there would be an increase in the general fund levy of just under $4.2 million, and most of those monies would be dedicated to personnel issues, and as you saw in the previous slide, much of it going to accomplish the implementation of the organizational analysis.
Okay.
And you've seen this slide before too. When we look at the overall costs, you can see that essentially the tax for the city and EDA, assuming that ramp up in the EDA as mentioned in a previous slide, would be about $1,369. And the monthly change would work out to about $12.43 for an annual amount of just under $150. That would be really in the kind of twice the normal amount that the city has experienced in the past. Really, it was more in the kind of $60 to $70, sometimes $80 range, depending on the year. The one thing I would note, though, is that if the property values actually remained the same and property taxes payable would actually decrease by about $67. Or put another way, because of the 8.8%, the rate is actually going to go down, and that's reflected in the document that was provided to the council earlier. And so the increase is actually attributable to the value of the underlying asset that's being taxed, in this scenario, the median valued residential homestead.
Okay.
So I think it's important, Dan, as you move on, just as a reminder, both for the council and for the community, these alternatives are all reflective of a proposed budget being balanced essentially to that 8.88% increase that we talked about in July and now are back in front of you with. The additional alternatives that Dan will talk about explore how we might use that fairly dramatic decrease in the tax rate to address the council's priorities moving forward in a slightly different way. So that's what Dan will walk through next.
Okay.
Thank you.
But it isn't new because you presented it with just holding the tax rate as it is rather than taking the reduction.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, for alternative number one,
Yeah.
that would allow the rate to go down to a rate above
That's right.
40%. Alternative number two, which Greg has already told me, apparently I have a talent for creating government parlance, is what we're calling the levy increase reduction alternative.
I did say that to you.
Or,
You should run for
like,
office.
like any good acronym, LIRA.
Which is equally the same.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. You know,
Increase and reduction in the
when you
same.
do what you love, you never work a day in your life.
Never work a day in your life.
So as you can see here, this is similar to what the council saw at the previous presentation when we talked about potentially exploring these alternatives. What this would essentially do is increase the general fund levy to match the property tax rate approximately. It wouldn't be an exact kind of one for one, but very close. It would be a 21.05% increase from the previous year for the levy that's assigned to the general fund, or just under 16% overall. Generally, what would happen in this scenario is the additional funds would be spent down over the next several years to essentially reduce the levy increases that would be required to accomplish the strategic vision of the council, most notably the organizational analysis. And so as you can see below in the black box, assuming, again, that change in the EDA fund, there would be about a 14.53% increase. And Madam Mayor, Councilmember Schultz, as you can see in this slide, it was actually 236%. I think I quoted you 234%. So slightly higher than that. So much like we saw at the previous presentation, you can see right now that would mean that the city and EDA tax would be just under $1,450, or about $223 more for taxes payable in 2023, or about $18.65 more per month. Also worth noting that the additional property tax would increase the annual cost per property by about $80 a year. So alternative number three is what we've termed the CIP enhancement alternative. Essentially, what this alternative would do is it would maintain the strategy that exists for the general fund. So you see the $35,169,000 in change that was reflected in alternative number one. But rather than dedicating all of the additional property tax levy revenue to the general fund, it would be divided equally between the equipment and vehicle capital project fund and the parks capital project fund. Essentially, what would happen is both of those funds would receive about $1,165,000 in additional revenue year over year to support their various capital projects. As the council may recall from the previous presentation, the equipment and vehicle fund is under extraordinary inflationary pressures, in some cases up to 20% on a single vehicle. And we do know that from the requests related to the Parks Capital Project Fund, Parks had requested in the neighborhood of $24 million in projects, and right now the city can only fund about $18 million over the next 5 years. So essentially a gap of about $6 million in capital project needs for the park system. This approach would essentially provide the additional monies to fund the gap in parks and to respond to the inflationary pressures in the equipment and vehicle fund. It's also worth noting that, especially as it relates to equipment and vehicle, certain borrowing that's planned for that fund could also come down and in some cases be eliminated, in which case then the city would also save money on interest expense related to equipment certificates, primarily for, I wish BJ was here to hear me say this, fire apparatuses. Apparati?
Apparati, I believe.
Something like that. So again, as you see below, that's the 14.53%. And again, since we are essentially matching the rate, the amount of taxes payable between alternative one and alternative three is actually the same as alternative two, because we're not changing the amount that's being levied, we're just redirecting it to different funds to meet different needs. So once again, $223 more, or $18.65. So for now, arguably the busiest slide of my career. This is the breakdown of the different alternatives. As you can see in alternative number one, the 8.88% that was discussed in the previous slides, If the council were to remain on this plan in 2024, there would have to be increases of 10.85%, followed by 12.87, 7.62, and then finally returning to a more normalized 3.33. The increases are primarily driven by the organizational analysis and the additional FTEs, and also a need for the levy to take a few years to fill in for the loss of the American Rescue Plan Act funds. So the council will recall that all 8 million and change of those monies are in the general fund. Once those go away, the levy has to make up the difference to fund the ongoing activities, and that happens in 2025. Under alternative number 2, the council would levy the 14.53%, and then those additional monies could then be used to buy down those levy increases over the previous year. The finance department attempted in this scenario essentially to smooth out or stabilize the property tax levy in the out years. So essentially you see the 7.6, the 7.06, 7.4, and 7.69. As I mentioned before, essentially what would happen is under this scenario, the council would levy the additional $2.3 million. The fund balance for the fund would go up. There are no planned expenditures for those monies, and then over time, that additional levy authority would then be used as additional costs came on, and then to manage the levy over those out years. And then the last one, the CIP enhancement, it essentially combines alternative 1 and alternative 2 in that it uses the levy increases to accomplish alternative number 1, and then it redirects the additional monies to those capital project funds while raising the levy enough to bring on the additional FTEs. So as you see, the 14.5 followed by the 10.59 and then 12.28, and then eventually once you get through the organizational analysis, then the levy can return to more typical levels, much like it does in alternative number 1. For points of reference, I've built this particular slide just to compare to the original 8.88. As you can see, alternative number 2 would raise about $500,000 in additional property tax revenue over the duration of the planning window. It would cost about $727, or about $60 more over the 5 years compared to alternative number 1 at $709. Alternative number 3, as you might imagine, is the most costly. It would raise an additional $2.6 million over the duration of the 5 years, and it would cost about $800 based on the median valued residential homestead, or about $66 more per month. So, based on all of that analysis and all the work done to date, the recommendation this evening by staff is for alternative number 2, the levy increase reduction alternative, for the proposed 2023 budget. This recommendation, I should say, was very much weighed heavily by staff. We in fact had a leadership team meeting and discussed it at length, and came out of that meeting as a group to recommend this to the council. The thing I would note is it implements the organizational analysis. It maintains those appropriate fund balances. As I mentioned, we were aiming for 43%. It stabilizes the property tax levy in each of the out years after the 14.5. And most importantly, I think it provides flexibility for the city council moving forward. I'd be remiss if I did not mention, and it is noted on the handout for the staff, that these numbers do not include anything that would be related to the implementation of the Phase 3 facilities projects, which will be considered at another time than this evening. But ultimately, with that additional property tax levy, the council would not have to make a decision about the 7% contemplated in 2024 until 2024. And in the intervening year, you would have the opportunity to hear more and learn more about your facilities projects and make decisions about those facilities, the future of the organizational analysis, what have you. It essentially keeps your options as wide as possible. It assumes only one double-digit property tax levy increase over the 5 years. You may recall each of the others had at least 3. And then most notably, over the 5 years, alternative number 2 is really less than $20 more than alternative number 1. So you get everything listed above on this slide for basically the price of a streaming service. In addition, I should say. So this is just another way to look at it. I know we've talked in the past about ordering off the menu. So As you can see here, we've gone down each of them and talked about some of the things that would happen under each of the different scenarios. It's not to say that the other ones wouldn't accomplish some of the positive things that would be accomplished by alternative number two, but really, alternative number two accomplishes many positive things for the organization. And to editorialize a bit, I think it puts the city in an excellent financial position, and it really does protect the future of the organization and allows the council to act on many of its strategic priorities moving forward. And in case you were wondering, we did a little research and looked at the peer cities to see what some of them were up to. This is a little difficult to read because some of them were they're at in their process, much like we are. They hadn't settled on a number. They had ranges. And as you can see between all of them, it works out to about an average of 8%. But Lakeville, Bloomington, Edina, all considering double-digit increases in their property tax levy. Apple Valley, 9%. So really, even at 14.5%, to be very candid about it, Burnsville would certainly be at the head of the class, but not by a long shot, especially with those other communities contemplating things like 12% increases in their property tax levy. And I can say, over my career, when I've looked at peer cities, 8% is far and away the highest average I have ever seen. Most of the time, it's in the 3, 4, 5% range. So it's an extraordinary number. And I think it's worth noting that even if the council were to move forward with the 14.5%, it is really not that far beyond what many of your peer communities are considering at this point in time. So with that, I would be happy to answer any questions the council may have. Probably the most important question is really which bag of chips do you think has the most air in it? I didn't think it would be Cheetos. It turns out it's Cheetos. As I told Greg before the meeting, I just hope you think this presentation was not full of air.
I just can't believe there's 28% air in a can of Pringles.
So the levy would be half of that 28%.
Something like that. I don't know what the comparison is.
Fritos, you get the most bang for your buck.
Well, very nicely done. Thank you so much, Dan T. Yeah. Greg, do you have any remarks that you want to make?
Just one. I'm sure that each of you have questions. We're happy to entertain those now. Certainly follow up. I am asking for the council's direction tonight as we prepare for max tax. Believe it or not, September 20th is just around the corner with just about a month remaining. There has been a considerable amount of staff time and effort that have been put in to getting us to this point. I know that you all have put an incredible amount of effort in as well. But we do need to narrow down on some direction this evening,
Sure.
so that would be my ask of the
Yeah.
council.
And yours and staff's recommendation is number 2, the levy increase reduction.
Madam Mayor, in all sincerity, I did not necessarily expect to be sitting in this seat right now. Secondly, I certainly wouldn't have expected to be recommending to you a 14.5% increase year over year to the property tax levy. I don't take that lightly, and with all of the work that has gone into this process, both from you and from staff, I believe that this is the most reasonable solution for the community to not only understand where our priorities are, but provide a necessary amount of flexibility into the future. And frankly, as I just look at the alternatives, provide us with a significant decision this year, but ultimately put us on a path that's more reflective of what we've talked about in the past, which is to do our best to stabilize and at the same time fully implement the organizational analysis that we've talked about now for nearly 8 months.
Okay. Vince, do you have any questions or comments?
I'm still kind of digesting all this right now. My original question when we first learned about this was how is this going to impact in the out years? And Dan did a great job kind of providing that to us. So it's just balancing a bigger chunk this year or 2 consecutive bigger chunks in 24 and 25 compared to alternative 1 and 2.
That's the thing we don't know.
That's just kind of my simple observation right out of the gate.
Dan G.?
Well, 14.53 is a pretty hefty increase, there's no doubt about that. But I think it comes with, for as long as I've been around, basically, that our staff, who are the subject matter experts, come to us with a budget that they plan out for what their needs are every year. And we have almost routinely sent them back to make it better. And we always seem to forget to ask, how does that affect us when we make them do those cuts better? All of a sudden, you're going from a 8% to a 5% or something like that. And so the optic of the 5% tax looks great to the taxpayer, but services get cut or people don't get hired. And those are the kind of things that happen. And I think we're at a time right now in this city, it's time to right the ship and start moving forward and providing the services that our citizens and our businesses expect from us. And I could go through a whole list of lack of inspectors for, electrical and plumbing to IT, and they have some of their issues going on. You certainly have public work issues going on. The police department, we know, are way down, and the fire department's down. And they're all very important to us. And I've said this before, every department in this city is important to the operation of this city. It's not just one particular segment of the city. Who we have working for the city is important to us. And we've got to start moving forward, and I believe we need to start investing in our city. We have not done anything with our EDA for as long as I can remember, and it just sits there. We've now given our economic development group some tools to work with, especially I'm excited about working with our neighborhoods, working with homeowners to help get their houses up to code, get some loans out for them that can't really afford to get it, and eventually we'll get paid back. And I'm not going to go through the whole program, but to not fund that now, I think is just wrong. And we can talk about whether it's a good time or not a good time. I have never been in this council when any time's been a good time to do anything. We just have to do things because of the needs of the city itself. And so I would actually be supportive of a max tax of the 14.53.
What staff is recommending?
Yes.
Okay. Kara?
So to clarify on that, option number 2, the average increase to our residents would be $60.60 a month. Do I have that number correct?
No.
Madam Mayor, members of
what
the
I'm
council, that would be $60 would be the additional per month in the total over the 5 years.
Okay,
So if
over
you
the
were to-
5 years. So you're giving a 5-year comparison.
Yeah.
Thank you, okay.
It's a big difference.
Because I was like, exactly, that's why I was like, let's check on this. So, thank you for that clarification.
So just to further clarify, so like, for example, in alternative number 1, the number you'd be looking at for that, for like 8.88 would be $11.99 for next year.
Thank you,
For 2023, yep.
Yeah.
appreciate that,
Yeah.
okay.
It's a total.
Second question is, so this does not include phase 3. Do we have any preliminary idea of how phase 3 starts to affect this? Because we're looking at doing a larger increase of possibly 14.5 this year, saying that there'll be less increases in the future. If we add phase 3 in, does that still hold true? Or how does that affect that?
And Madam Mayor,
Dan T.
members
or
of the-
Greg? I mean, because I know you've calculated all of this into your,
It looked like Dan was ready to go, so I'll
Go,
defer
Dan.
to him.
Happy to do it. Jump in whenever you'd like, sir. Madam Mayor, members of the council, so it does not, at this point in time, include any additional property tax levy authority as it relates to Phase 3 facility improvement projects. Primarily, what would happen is if the council were to move forward with those projects and borrow money, there could be additional debt service related, in which case then these numbers would change. And they would likely go up given the amount of money that is being contemplated for Phase 3 improvements. A few caveats to that statement.
Right.
One, we do not know the total amount at this point in time for Phase 3 improvements. We have talked about, and since Garrett is not here, I will say 75 to potentially $100 million, depending on when they come online as it relates to inflationary pressures. Just things get more expensive as you wait. We don't know the phasing of those projects, meaning that the first one could happen in '26, and then maybe 3 years or 3 years. Hard to know. That's something that will have to be determined at some point in time in the future. And the third great unknown is in the recent past when the council has discussed the Phase 3 projects, there is still some policy decisions that need to be made about the actual funding source. So would it be the property tax levy, or would it be franchise fees, or would it be some combination of the two? So given those basically three moving parts, we don't know the amount, we don't know the phasing, and we don't necessarily know the funding sources at this point in time. There is nothing built into this analysis that relates to those projects. If the council were to make choices about those projects happening sooner rather than later within this planning window, and decided to use the property tax levy and eventually settled on a particular amount for those projects, these numbers would change. And they would likely be above the amounts listed in any of the alternatives. Now, the thing that I would add, and part of the reason that alternative number 2 has been recommended this evening, is that additional $2.3 million could be used for debt service in the future. It's not to say the council would use it for debt service. It's that the option remains available and the council would have the flexibility and have the additional year to learn more about the projects. Right now, I don't want to be too out on the front of my skis, but my understanding is that the council will get some information about the facilities fund and some of the projects in October.
That is correct.
So we'll have some more information then. And that $2.3 million, depending on term and interest rates at the time and the amount, if we were to say 3% for 20 years, that would probably win the council somewhere in the range of $35 million of debt service. Now, this is where the great trade-off would happen. If you were to use all of those monies for debt service, you would abandon, let's say we did option 2.
Yeah.
That would go away, and the council would have to make choices about the organizational analysis implementation. Does it slow down? Is it on hiatus? Are you going to raise property taxes more to accomplish hiring those things? And in reaching back to the earlier point about flexibility, you would have the opportunity really next year to decide that. And you would have more information about how the organizational analysis implementation was going. You'd have more information about the facilities projects, and you would have really the broadest possible angles in which to move if you decided. And that is one, as indicated by the slide that's up right now, one of the many reasons that staff is recommending the 14.5, given what I'll characterize as kind of the great flux around the Phase 3 facilities projects.
Okay,
Thank you, appreciate it.
okay, great. Dan K., or did you want to add to that?
I have nothing to add, Madam Mayor.
Okay, Dan K.
Well, first of all, I support the additional staff, especially PD and FD, baked into the 8.8% levy increase. A large portion of that is going to public safety, and that is where I'm not wavering regardless of the levy number, even though it's twice as high as anything that I've ever had to really consider. Because one of the things I've learned from talking with a lot of citizens over the last couple of months or so, their safety and security is a concern of theirs, given today's environment. And when you explain that a big portion of our staff increase relating to an increase in the levy that is larger than they're used to is going to public safety, including our paramedics, it's an automatic, yes, I support that. And so I think everyone is interested in shoring up our public safety, and I think the majority of our citizens, in fact, I haven't talked to anybody who disagreed with that, are on board with that. To the idea of the 14.5%, my concern, one, is we're deviating from a long-standing approach to our budget, and whereas if we are going to use that 1 year, what happens if we flip back if property values fall? You can't use a mill rate very well in a market that is headed down. Then you have to raise your tax rate. And so I think it's dangerous for us to consider something like this just because of the opportunity year of a 16.5%, which is unreal. increase in property values, because that's not sustainable, number one. And what goes up that high usually comes back down. And so I feel like we're opening ourselves up to be criticized for, well, you use that because of that, but now you're turning around and you're just raising my taxes again. So because that rate or that model didn't work for you, now that my housing value is falling a little bit or not increasing fast enough. So little concerned about moving to that model. It's also still just real dollars. I mean, 14.5%, you can incrementally coffee or streaming service it up, but it adds up to a lot of money. And right now, there's a lot of unsettled economic news and economic activity. And I'm very happy you shared with us the Wells Fargo economic chart, because it does give comfort that maybe if there is a softening of the economy, it's likely not going to be that severe, because there's so many factors that are not conventionally working in the direction of a deeper recession, which is great news for everybody. I hope that's what comes out of this. But in the meantime, it is very difficult. Inflation has just, and gas prices have walloped a person's family budget. And I think they look to City Hall to be part of the solution, not piling on and being part of the problem. I mean, 14.5 is a lot higher than the 9% inflation we've been dealing with. So it kind of looks to me like we're piling on. So I don't think, and I would not support moving to the 14.5, even though it pays, even though it's predicted and forecasted to provide some relief in future years. That never works out. In all 16 years that I've sat here and gone through budgets, the forecasted percent levies have never, ever been very close. And why is because you can only use the information you have at your fingertips today to forecast what's going to happen in the next 5 years. So it is to the best of our knowledge. And I think Dan has done a good job of qualifying, qualifying this. That's assuming everything happens exactly based on what we know today. And that has been the mantra of every financial presentation that we've gone through. And then when we come to the next year, it's like all the numbers get rejumbled and suddenly they change, right? Something happens, for example, a $1.9 million infusion into our Parks Capital Fund that we didn't know about 6-8 months ago. Now that's coming in. And so there's future development. There's also future potential costs, but we seem to have a better control of what those costs are, aside from a recession, inflation at this rate, like vehicles and fire trucks going up every day. It seems like it's like the national debt. The price of that fire truck goes up every single day, so buy it as quick as you can. It's like getting into a no-win situation bidding on eBay in the last few minutes, or in the old days of bidding where you just keep escalating it up. That's unfortunate, and we have to deal with it, unfortunately, because there's equipment that we absolutely have to have, and we can't just wait until things settle back down, because we don't know where that price is going to land when it does settle down. It could still be 40% higher. And so I have been, and I guess I've gotten comfortable making the decision based on the current year and what we know about the current year, meaning next year, and not saying, well, if we do this, we'll be able to do that. I mean, case in point, last year when we passed at 4.8, we anticipated 5.7 for the next 3 or 4 years. Why? Where did that go? So
We didn't get good information.
It really
I can
is.
tell you where it went.
It really is very, very difficult. And I would not suggest anybody make a decision on next year's tax rate based on what they believe that'll do to the following 2 or 3 years, because we don't know what the following 2 or 3 years really is going to produce as far as revenue and or expenses. On the EDA, I'll comment and wrap up my comments there. I absolutely want to help this city get into a better position to redevelop blighted properties and our regional mall. I believe our position, and my position, has always been government stays out of what the private sector does until the private sector does not bring a solution forward. And unfortunately, our regional mall went into decay in the hands of a private sector owner. It declined. We got lip service. It continued to decline. We continued to get lip service until it was 50% vacant and in horrible condition. Dirt that was there for a year, leaves and debris and gravel and stains in the carpet that just never got cleaned. And that was a private sector owner, and we couldn't do anything about it. We could potentially take a role if certain circumstances come up, bankruptcy filings, properties going for sale, where the city could actually consider purchasing property, taking the direction of the mall and turning it around and actually profit and bring the money back to the taxpayers bigger than what we spent on the front end, because it's becoming one of those circumstances, almost like the mall selling at a bankruptcy sale for 17 million when it was once worth 135 million. I do want to help our EDA get into a position where we have the ability to do something to help when those circumstances happen. There's another property we've talked about many times that is in a similar situation. And it's a pretty high bar. I just want to make it very clear. I have a very high bar for what I would personally vote in support of where government steps into that private sector. It's blighted properties that are going nowhere, that are dragging the city down in a bad situation for years on end. And unfortunately, I believe our regional mall has hit that point. And I've gone through there so many times in the last couple of years or so and been convinced that there is a better path, even though it's headed in the right direction and there's some new money being infused. So it is definitely starting to turn. But there's a road that needs to go through there, and there's a Sears building that needs to be demolished. And that, to me, is going to be the biggest significant trigger to begin the full redevelopment in the city, to be able to maybe one day have it valued at 135 million again. But the city has to have a role in that. What I don't agree with is the consultant's recommendation to escalate the EDA up as fast as it is presented. And quite frankly, consultants aren't sensitive to taxpayers. They don't approach their work knowing that these are real dollars coming out of real people's wallets, even though they live in a city and they have to live with that city's increases. And so they're doing what looks good on paper and what achieves a certain goal. They're not paid to be sensitive to taxpayers, as we are elected. And so I do agree that we need to invest. In fact, a few years ago, you'll remember, I pushed to take the EDA to 100,000 and got pushed back. So I'm an EDA proponent. I'm not an EDA proponent that says, let's take it in your rocket ship up that fast. I don't think we need to put that weight on the taxpayers at this time, but I do support an increase in the EDA. So I think I've covered the levy, my options, or I didn't specify the option, but I'm not going to vote in favor of the 14.5%. And I would not vote with the EDA as it is presented, but I will vote for an EDA increase. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
I just want to say something, Dan. You talked about the 4.8% and the 5.7, and where did that go? If you recall, that 4.8%, it did not anticipate us hiring one single new person for this city. And the 5.7 for the next 4 years did not anticipate us hiring one new person for this city besides replacements we have. And that's why you're seeing such a big difference in this. And I know you want to kind of stay with the policy that you have, past policies that you've worked with most of the time you've been here, but quite frankly, I'm not sure they always work for us. We're in a position in the city, we are understaffed. Our employees are getting burnt out, and we need to do something about it. We can't just sit there and say, well, you can wait. We've got to do something about it. We're in an employment environment that we either take charge of this thing, or we can just sit there and pay $4,000 or $5,000 every time we have to replace somebody that left. That's what concerns me. And I'm concerned with the taxpayer, and I'm one of them. I live in this city. I have to pay these as well. And so I disagree with that. And as far as the EDA, it's not just commercial property. We have neighborhoods that are in trouble that need a lot of help. And we need to start getting in there and helping these neighborhoods. We give a lot of money to business, but we give very little to the residential area of this city. And when you talk to the homeowners in the Vista View area and a few others, they need some help. They just need help. And we need to start taking a look at that. You know, public safety is very important for us, but part of public safety is also having strong neighborhoods that look good and that people have pride and ownership. And we've got to help bring that back to this community. It's very important.
Madam Mayor, I'll just,
Yeah.
if I may, you made a comment, Councilmember Gustafson, about we need people in the city. My opening statement was I support the additional staff, especially PD and PD, in the 8.8, which includes all the staff that's requested for 2023. So
I get that, but I'm just saying, you just specify public safety all the time. There are other parts of this organization that need help.
and
That's
they're
what I'm
included-
saying.
They're
Let's look at
included
it
in
all.
the 8.8, and I said I supported it, so I'm not sure what you're bringing up as far as an objection to that,
I'm
but.
not objecting to that, I'm just objecting that all you talk about is public safety, and there's more to the city than public safety.
Well, given public safety.
How about we just not do this?
Yeah, let's-
How about we just not do this?
What should we not do, Kara? We're having a discussion.
No, this
This
is
is
not
not
a
a discussion?
discussion.
Yeah, no.
This is
We're not hollering at
pecking.
each other. We're not
This is
screaming at each
pecking
other.
like chickens.
Okay, I think
Not
both of
needed.
you have made your point.
Yep, we have.
Thank you so much. Okay, Vince,
I did it
are you
twice.
ready
I
to
didn't
make
say that.
any remarks? Have you digested and listened to everybody and,
Yeah, I appreciate my colleagues' opinions, but I'm not leveraging my decision based solely on what they say either. I'm trying to figure out. I agree that the EDA increase is aggressive at 243%. 234, almost got it. And Dan, I apologize, but what were we substantiating that in? You know, did we narrow that down to specific programs, or were we? Was that just we have things that we want to do, and this is a good way to start doing them, or did we? Or Greg, whomever.
Dan?
Councilmember Workman, great question. The proposal, as it originated in the financial management plan, really had, and Dan can correct me technically when I'm wrong, but really had two primary drivers. The first would be to fund existing council-approved or adopted programs or policies. So Councilmember Gustafson mentioned a few, I won't go into the details, but generally supporting those economic development activities. The second, and admittedly the much larger component, is saving money and building towards having cash on hand to be able to, I think Councilmember Keeley put it well, participate in an appropriate way as a public entity when the private market is not delivering on your vision for the community. And we recognize, and if you recall back, I actually wish we had it in this slide deck, but in the original financial management plan and the updated financial management plan, there was some slides that started to compare to our market cities, where are we in terms of the cash on hand for economic development activities? And we're painfully behind. We just are. And that is absolutely, don't hear me wrong, I don't want the council to misinterpret or the community. That's the council's prerogative. That's your policy decision. My recommendation to you is we need to come up with a plan to remedy that situation over what is essentially planned to be a 10-plus year period of time, right? So it's not an immediate solution. It doesn't put us in a position where we can buy Burnsville Center tomorrow, albeit I wish it did. It just doesn't. What it does do is position you or a future council and the community down the road to be able to consider those options. And the real policy question at hand for the EDA is how aggressive do you as a council want to be about it, right? That is the fundamental policy question in terms of the approach to the EDA. Staff, have admittedly made assumptions since the initial financial management plan based on the conversation we've heard from you and the direction that we've had in these conversations to maintain that original recommendation. It was the recommendation that came out of the financial management plan. That plan was built by our partners at Ellers, absolutely, but I will also take full responsibility for the recommendation that's in front of you from a staff perspective, weighing all of the realities, and most importantly, driven by your vision and your strategic priorities. I believe that the plan that's put in front of you is the most reflective of those priorities. Again, that is your policy decision, council.
Okay. Yeah.
So
Karen?
that's a good explanation of it, but do we have an idea of the breakdown of percentage increase that goes to those two particular pots?
Dan T?
Madam Mayor, members of the council, we do not have a breakdown per se. At this point in time, the financial analysis assumes that all of the money would fall to fund balance. Part of the reason we do not have a breakdown is the city is currently sans a community development director.
Yep.
So we would imagine,
Yeah.
once that person comes
On board.
on board with the organization, and of course with the city manager's approval, and eventually the council's authorization, we would have firm recommendations for you about those particular programs. But generally, based on some of the properties that the council has expressed interest in the past in working with, or even outright acquiring, and the amount of money that would be needed,
Yeah.
even at the so-called kind of more aggressive ramp up in the levy, it would still take a decade to have those funds available to, for example, be involved in conversations about Burnsville Center, or,
Or 13 in Diffley.
Madam Mayor, members of the council,
It takes
even
time for that.
even a small strip mall may cost $3 or $4 million to acquire. In that scenario, that would be, even in this ramp up, it would take a handful of years for the council to have those resources available.
Okay. Do you have
So
a follow-up?
the-
While Vince is still cogitating.
The reason I ask is, y'all know I'm not voting for this. However,
I was gonna say, it doesn't matter, you're not voting for it anyways, but
however,
We appreciate that clarity.
what I'm sensing
You were very
from
clear at the
council-
very beginning.
Yeah, I mean, but I'm sensing that council is perhaps searching for a compromise. And I'm looking for the information that could maybe assist my fellow council members in coming to that. If that makes sense to
can I
everyone.
tell you what I'm looking for, Kara? I would like us just to start listening to staff.
Make it rain? No.
I just would like us to actually listen to the people we hire.
We
to
are
make this
listening to
yeah.
staff, but these are questions of policy.
I
And
know.
questions of policy are our area. They are bringing options to us, which we
Yes.
can take in whole, or we can take in part.
Yeah.
Okay.
We
Okay,
get to do that.
I know we do,
Yeah,
Okay.
we do.
but for one time, I'd like to listen to staff.
okay. All
Okay,
right,
well, you
okay.
listen to staff, and the rest of us will all just tell them to
Okay.
screw off.
There you go.
Because,
Okay.
that's what you're
Okay,
saying.
okay, come on.
You are just
Okay.
a joy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Vince? Do you have any thought,
Greg, you're looking for a max tax number tonight.
that's right.
Councilmember Workman, that is the fundamental question in front of us,
Yeah.
yes. And I will, Vince, not to interrupt, sorry. We do have a tentative meeting scheduled September 13th. We do have other items. We'll have to split the meeting up, but I'm fully planning at this point in time, probably much to my interim CFO's chagrin, that the council will need more time to talk. So for as much as it would be efficient for staff to fully have direction from the council tonight, I know how this works. And I'm sensing that the group, to Councilmember Schultz's earlier point, probably is going to need some more time to talk. But just to be aware, we do have that meeting scheduled. That is admittedly very close to a max tax decision on September 20th. So my one word of caution to the council would be,
Yeah.
I need a pretty good idea on direction
Okay.
tonight, because otherwise I'm going to be scrambling that week,
Yeah.
and I don't think that's good for anyone.
No. So while you're still thinking, Vince, I will make my remarks.
Okay.
One of the things in all of my years sitting in this chair we have been a very conservative community. And we have been very thoughtful as a legislative body, the city council, in looking at how we manage the city. And also exercising our fiduciary responsibility to our residents and to our businesses. Always at the forefront has always been, how do we redevelop and build the tax base? How do we increase the tax base? And I remember going back, and you guys probably get sick of, but it is an experience that we went through, and we have reality checks. And that is the 54-acre site that is now known as the heart of the city, and it was blighted, just like some of the commercial property around the city that we're trying to look at with regard to EDA funds. But it was a 54-acre site that yielded something like $240,000 in property tax. Now it makes over $1 million in property tax. But it was a time where we talked to the residents, and we had to purchase property. We had to purchase the AAA building, which allowed us to have a site for the Performing Arts Center, for Nicollet Commons Park. It allows us to have remnant piece of property that we sold to the Mediterranean cruise. And we brought in a lot of new development that allowed us to see the increase in our property tax. We have been very conservative, and what has happened is that our staff has fallen into, well, if we ask for any more, the council's not going to approve it. So they became highly conservative, but they've always been, from my perspective, been conservative, been good stewards of the public's trust, and that's why there's always been a time where staff didn't even, they spent it below what they budgeted. And so I thank staff for that. But we're at a different time in our life, and a different time in the city of Burnsville. We're a city that has aged. Our neighborhoods are showing its wear and tear. Some of our commercial properties are showing its tiredness, and it has cost us in property value, especially with the Burnsville Center and the property on Diffley and 13. And I'm sure there are others. But because we brought in new product, we expanded the tax base. So when I look at what staff has presented to us and everything that we have gone through, and the 14.5 is hard, difficult, but hard. But when I listen to our residents and people in the community, they have agreed that we have been very conservative in the way that we have managed the city. But they also say that you have to start taking care of the city. So when I look at the alternative number 2, that's a hard nut, but I think this is something that we need to do. And then I look at the stabilization of 24, 25, and 26, and 27. So it's predictable. Now, I know, Councilmember Keeley, that you say every year it's going to be different, but there's something about the way that we're doing things now that I trust that our city manager and our staff that we have a CFO that has returned to Burnsville, but I also know that we will still have Ellers to help us as we go through a lot of this. So I'm trusting in what this need, in the numbers that I'm looking at. Because they're predictable, but there's going to give us some flexibility with the things that we need to get done. And so
They feel confident.
it's difficult, but I am going to support alternative number 2 because of all that we need to do in this city. And we're asked to make sure that the city continues to be vibrant. The city is not what it was when I came into office. It's different. And it has its strengths and its weaknesses. And so I'm trusting that this is going to help us with all of that. So this is difficult, but alternative 2 allows us to do what we need to do that the citizens expect of us. Vince?
I'm gonna say that I'm comfortable proceeding with alternative 2, but I'd like to look into it a little deeper in our future budget meetings, and make sure we're not, and I don't think that we are. I trust Greg, I trust Dan, I trust our staff. But I'd like to examine it a little closer, to identify some of those things like the EDA and, some of those formalities that we don't know at this current moment. When I think about what we would prepare for in the next 10 years, Diffley 13 obviously jumps out as a primary property that we would want to look at. But that's not to say we haven't been engaged with them over the last 5 years.
But we didn't have the money.
Well, but I think in 2018, we did go to them and talk about buying that, and there was no interest, and then obviously those things have changed, but, because we weren't gonna overpay for that corner.
No.
They were asking for the moon.
Yeah, but we still didn't even have
Well-
$1 million to rub.
So they must have known something, because,
And they got the money they wanted.
well, they're still sitting on it, but, I'd like to just sharpen this down a little bit more, and understand it a little bit more. Because outside of that property, I don't see us being huge players in the Burnsville Center area. I feel like that whole area is gonna kind of take off on its own with the investments that are being made there. And we're already seeing that with the Panda Express and the new lifestyle center they're proposing,
And we have TIF.
and TIF.
Yeah, we
So
don't have TIF with,
It just begs the question, we're preparing a war chest, but for what? And I understand that we're an aging city and all these things, but a little bit more detail on that. Obviously, 2025, the ARPA money is gone. This is considering that. If the staffing piece of this, that clearly I think the council is in agreement with the 8.8 to get our staffing needs met. So that's been digested and discussed at length, and we've got a good understanding of the whys for that. So then it would just be that, maybe not that same lengthy process, but the same type of process where we can get in and understand, the above and beyond that 8.8 and how we're justifying it, because
so are you agreeing to the 14.5 for the max tax? Is that what I heard you say?
I'm agreeing to proceed with the alternative number 2
Yeah.
for tonight's meeting, and so Greg can start working on defining that a little bit more.
So Mayor, if I may.
Yeah.
what I think I'm hearing from the majority of the council is there is general support for the implementation of the organizational analysis, which really is reflective of the 8.88%
Yep.
increase that was put in front of you in July, and you see as alternative number one this evening.
Yeah.
I'm also hearing general support from the council for the alternative number two, with the caveat that the council would like to have additional discussion ahead of and post a max tax decision about our use of particularly the EDA fund and that mechanism. What I could offer you are a couple of options to do that. First, we have the September 13th work session already scheduled for the budget. I would suggest that the council at least have some discussion that evening, particularly hearing Councilmember Workman's comments. With a bit of hesitation that I don't have a community development director right now. And I think that to be fair to the community and to be fair to our future, certainly we'll bring in our expert staff that we have to help inform that conversation. But I would like the council to know that there needs to be a bit of flexibility in that reality, just because there's some unmet talent and needs that we have to best answer your questions on some of that, which frankly I think probably underscores the importance of having the conversation. So a bit of a full circle there. So we can certainly bring a conversation on the EDA back to the council September 13th in preparation for a max tax that would reflect alternative number two at the 14.5%, knowing that number always can go down, right?
Yeah.
It gives us the capacity to have that conversation, the ability to have that conversation, and I think it would also reflect staff's capacity to answer the council's questions productively.
Yeah.
Greg,
Yeah. Kara?
is there any way, even if it is a short discussion, even if it's on a round table or something like that, maybe just to have a few questions answered ahead of that September 13th date, so maybe the 6th. And if there's any way, even for a short period of time, then maybe council will feel more comfortable hitting that September 13th date to do the vote on max tax.
So max tax would be September 20th at your regular council
Oh,
meeting.
September
on
20th.
We
Yeah.
do have a work session scheduled for
For
the
the
budget
13th.
on September 13th.
Yeah.
Okay, how much time do we have allotted on that?
Right now, I've got about 2 hours planned, and the council knows that my track record on planning time is not so great. So you might
Okay.
want to increase that a bit.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think so. You know, I just think if council can have just a little more time
Yep.
to have a discussion that is not on the night that we vote,
Yep,
like that
absolutely.
might just
Well,
be
yeah,
too
we can't
Correct.
have that on the 20th. No.
Right,
The
because that'll be a
13th,
quick,
Yeah.
it's usually very
Yeah.
quick.
yeah,
And
yeah.
also, you know, we have our one-on-ones, and perhaps if anyone has other questions, they can
Yep.
get those answered in their one-on-ones as well, and then bring that back for a discussion, and,
Kara, I think.
On the 13th.
Excuse me.
yeah.
Go ahead.
I think to your point, then it does make the most sense that we bring a conversation on the budget back to the
Yeah.
council as planned,
Yeah.
tentatively planned on September 13th, ahead of your max tax vote on September 20th at your regular council meeting.
Yeah.
The direction I'm hearing from the council tonight, though, is there's a majority of you who are saying proceed with the alternative number two. So
Yeah.
I will start preparing max tax and
Yeah.
affirming with our finance department that that's the direction that we're moving.
Right,
Knowing that some changes can be made through the process, certainly.
Yeah.
But that does give the council another opportunity ahead of a
Yeah.
max tax vote to answer some of the questions. I'll make sure that when Chief Junman is back in town, that he and I circle our staff and our team together to address the EDA questions that have come
Yeah.
up tonight.
right.
And then we can also be prepared for
Yeah.
any questions that you might share ahead of time with me that you would like to discuss as a
Yeah.
group. My one hesitation, and just by way of reminder, the agreement that we had made heading into the budget conversation was we're going to try to do our best to avoid one-on-one conversations.
That's right.
About the budget. So I'm certainly happy to entertain questions, and as we always do, we talk, right? But it's also important to me, and it's important for the leadership team and the community that
To
we
be transparent.
that we continue these conversations
Yeah.
in this
I
forum.
think it's more so that people, if they have additional questions, they can get them to you ahead of time.
Yep, absolutely,
And
That
then-
way staff
yeah.
knows the questions that are gonna be
Yeah.
asked,
totally heard.
and they can be prepared for
And
that.
I absolutely agree.
And
Yeah.
then
Thank
on
you.
your weekly, you can talk about what was discussed and what was your answer on
And-
some of those, just like you do
Yes,
on
ma'am.
your weeklies. For me, when I look at this, I don't like seeing, when you look at number one, alternative one, you see double digits, even on 25. And then the same with alternative number three. I don't like seeing all those double digits, so taking a big bite and then going down to single digits and predictable. And if there's a way for Dan T. and you, Greg, just looking to say, okay, these are projections, but how do we look at those in a way that we can say it's predictable?
I don't want people to hang their hat on
No,
that. Because the
it's-
caution is that we do have that 75 million to 100 million
Yeah,
coming up in phase three.
Yeah,
And we have different
but-
funding mechanisms, which
Yeah.
we haven't selected yet. But if those funding mechanisms
Yeah.
go into property tax,
Yeah.
we very well could be looking at double-digit
yeah.
Increases.
For 25, 26.
so, or before to ramp up for it so that we're
Yeah.
ready for it.
Yeah. Because those
so,
projections
you
won't
know,
come
just-
until later.
You know, we have to have the projections because we have to have something
Yeah.
to go off of. But that's a big caveat for those,
Yeah,
for future funding. Because
yeah.
I'm not prejudicing the vote, but I do not see council not moving forward with phase three.
No,
Like, I
I know
don't.
that we're going to move forward with phase
Yeah.
three.
So-
Yeah, and it's a must.
Yeah.
But I'm also going to trust that, we do have another revenue stream. But the other thing is that, what are some of the other tools in the toolkit when we look at bonding and how we can bond for all of that? So,
Mayor, to your point, Councilmember Schultz, to your point, absolutely.
Yeah.
The budget is a snapshot in time.
Yeah.
This is our, I can't say my, this is our, it's very much a we proposition.
Yeah.
Our best work in
Yes.
providing the council a view of where we are today. And things will change.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
To Councilmember Schultz's point. I'll also remind the council, because I think it's an important point to underscore, the balanced budget at 8.88% only includes, only is a hard word there, it includes 19
Yeah.
of the 56 FTEs that
Yeah.
are recommended in the organizational analysis. Said
Yeah.
another way, those out years, we have
Are
a lot
not-
of work to continue to do, right?
Yeah.
And that's where alternative number two, from my perspective and our recommendation,
Yeah.
that we were trying to provide an alternative to the council, given what we know today, to potentially provide for some stability and some longer-term commitment to actually seeing the implementation of the full organizational analysis through.
Exactly.
okay.
Councilmember Schultz, to your point, there are still unanswered questions, even with what the council seems to agree on in the organizational analysis. We've told
Very
you,
true.
Tanya's not here this evening, but we've told you, I've authorized a full and complete staffing study of the police operation. That could mean more costs coming back to you. It just could. So I don't want to get, to your point, I don't want to get too, I don't want to be unclear about this proposal is a snapshot in time. It's our best plan right now with the information and the direction that we have from you. And there are always things that could change that.
Yeah,
Yes.
Absolutely.
And we appreciate
So-
the thoroughness of this.
Yeah.
This has been excellent. I do appreciate it. Thank you.
yeah.
Councilman,
So
my pleasure.
what you have is a support for the 14.5 for a max tax, but coming back with some more clarification to the questions that Vince had put on the table. and then we'll take a look at that. But otherwise, staff, you have direction for the alternative number 2. Okay?
We will see you on September 13th for a follow-up budget conversation ahead
Yeah.
of your vote on the max tax or
Yeah.
the preliminary levy on September 20th.
Okay. Anybody else? Any other comments?
I guess the only parting comment I'd make, Greg, is how do I explain the additional 5.65% to my neighbor Doug, who isn't watching this meeting right now?
Yes, I hear you. And I think that can be, we can dive into that conversation more on the 13th. And it's certainly my commitment, not only to you, Councilmember Workman, and to the council, but to the community, that once I do have policy direction on this, it's my job, it's our collective job to go engage with and communicate
Yep.
among the community, right?
Yep.
That's not solely your responsibility in your policy making, that is part of what we're here to do, and part of our commitment to engagement with the
Yeah.
community. So those talking points and information to help tell that story will certainly be part of what we provide to
Yeah.
you once we've firmed up that direction.
Yeah.
Right, Carissa?
Yep.
Yeah.
Making a note to do a 2-page spread in the bulletin.
We're already on it.
Okay.
But yes, we will do that, Vince.
Yeah.
Facebook posts about budgets are probably our highest.
Yeah, those probably are not
Rated.
super.
Yeah, they probably aren't the most effective. Again, it's that whole, what is social media good for and not?
Yeah, no. Okay. If there's nothing else to come before us, I want to thank staff and Greg, for you and the leadership team. Yeah, for all of the work that you've done to bring this budget before us. Really, very, I'm truly grateful, and I'm sure that my colleagues also are grateful for all of that. So,
And thank you, Council. We appreciate it likewise. This is a team activity, both between the leadership team and the council, and we appreciate the approach this year. And I would share that sentiment, just looking around the table at the faces of our leaders
Well-
who are here tonight. There's a lot of time and energy and effort that's been invested in this, and I really appreciate it.
but I really appreciate that you all followed. When we got together in January in our all-day work session, we said that we're going to do this together. And you all have done that. And you've brought information to us on an ongoing basis that everyone understands and is informed. And so this has been a transparent process, and I appreciate that. So thank you. Please make sure that everyone knows of our appreciation for the work to those who are not present.
Yep.
So with that, we're going to go to roundtable, and there's just one item on roundtable.
Madam Mayor, we
Yes.
do a 10-minute bio break before we jump into the roundtable.
Yes, we're going to take a break. So 7 minutes?
A human needs break.
Yeah, a human needs break. Okay. Okay. Good evening, and we are back. So, the next item on our agenda this evening is roundtable, and there's one item on roundtable, and that's the fiber grant opportunities. Councilmember Gustafson, I think this is your,
It is, Madam Mayor. I wanted to bring it to council to talk about, as we all know, the federal government has got a lot of broadband-type initiatives going on right now. And there's one that's going to be due, I believe, sometime in September, and it's about the middle mile for the Burnsville, for not just for Burnsville, but for cities all over. Normally, had the DBB still been doing something, which they're not right at the moment while they figure out what they're going to do, they would normally be applying for these grants on behalf of the entire county. And I would like to have our council talk about applying for these grants on behalf of the city, because we're going to have to kind of go it on our own if we want to get any of these. And this could be worth us, I'm not sure how much, I imagine $1 million or better to finish out all that stuff. And I don't have all the information on it, but I believe it's all about finishing up the middle mile so we can connect the entire city and be done with the fiber in the city as far as what we would do as a city as far as providing a highway for internet in the city itself.
yeah. Council, and Councilmember Gustafson and members of the council, I don't think that grant opportunities is just for the fiber. It's only the one that is coming due with regard to.
Yes,
but
it's coming due for the middle mile, yes.
But the thing that I think we ought to talk about and direct staff is how do we get into making sure that we are also getting into these opportunities for grants. We don't have anyone on staff, so I would ask the council to direct staff to look at what are the opportunities. Even if we use a consultant until, Greg, you and staff can come up with a solution. Because there's a lot of money from the federal government, and I think we all pay taxes to the federal government, income tax, our businesses pay taxes, and I'd like to see some of that money come home. And we used to have someone who did that, and we have benefited. From all of those grants. The ice center with the geothermal system, that was $700,000. And there was so much more that we got in grants. And now that but it takes a lot of work. And to find the monies inside, because it's in so many pots, but also to comply with federal guidelines, and because they're all going to be single audit. So, council, with your permission, shall we direct Greg and staff to take a look and see what they would come back with regard to perhaps at this point, until Greg can figure out who can write grants within our organization, but probably a consultant. One of the things I do know is that the group that is our consultant, our legislative lobbyist, Ann Lancheski's firm, they have a DC firm, and they have grant writers on their staff. Maybe it's something to explore. But if, with council's approval, we direct staff to take a look at, perhaps at this point, a consultant to take a look at what the opportunities for grants are for us.
I have no objection to that as long as, let me back up. What is your recommendation for this, or what is your process that you would prefer?
Councilmember Schultz, I am not, but Tom's here and can speak to the middle mile opportunities that that Councilmember Gustafson was speaking to far better than I can. I will say that with council's direction, we will reprioritize and do whatever you direct. What you make a policy position, we will carry out. I think from a staff perspective, my caution would be, we know enough to be dangerous. I certainly know enough to be dangerous about the requirements, what's available to us, and what would be a wise investment of staff time. I would defer to Tom to speak more appropriately to that. More broadly, Mayor, to your comments, we prioritize being creative and looking for alternative funding sources. Actually, I think it's one of the hallmarks of our leadership team and our staff. We don't have someone specifically on staff for grant writing or grant management. It is part of the recommendation in the organizational analysis a couple of years out. And we can find alternatives to that between now and then, right? So based on your direction. But I think kind of specifically I would turn to Tom on the fiber opportunities specifically, which I think is the more immediate emergent question because there's some deadlines involved.
Sure.
And then I would ask the council to give me a little bit of space to get through the budget process, to kind of re-engage some of the other priorities that I've put on pause that you all have asked us about.
I know.
And manage any sort of additional thinking about grants more broadly in a bit of a more thoughtful and timed out approach. That would be my ask back.
Yeah,
Okay.
okay. Tom?
Madam Mayor, council members, thank you for having me here tonight to speak on a subject that I've spent very little time on, but I know enough that it can help us proceed with some conversation regarding it. Specifically, the grant that Councilmember Gustafson is referring to is called the Middle Mile Grant. That's right now opened up for applications by many eligible organizations, the city being one of those. It's a federal grant that's being administered by the National Telecommunications and Infrastructure Administration. And it opened actually in June of this year, and it has a closing date of September 30th. So approximately 30-plus days away from now to reach the application process. This one specifically there's $1 billion available that for release, and the awards are anywhere from $500 to $1 million each, depending on your application and what you're applying for. It specifically is called a middle mile grant because it focuses on utilizing fiber optic infrastructure to extend or aggregate connections in a community to allow for anybody to connect to those fiber infrastructure and deliver services to the residents and businesses or what they consider anchor institutions in the community. And anchor institutions make up schools, libraries, healthcare centers, hospitals, and other quasi-government organizations. There is a cash match on this particular grant of 30% with the possibility of a 70% award for funds, again, between that $5 million and $100 million amount. And there's a requirement to build out that middle mile activity within a 5-year period. So there's some very specific goals to be met and reached. One of the caveats of the grant, it looks for how you will connect to anchor tenants within the community. And it also expects that there's going to be partner organizations in the application process. That's one of the challenges of this grant in particular. I've reached out to our partners at the county. They are not applying for this grant. I have not reached out to other adjacent communities at this point in time. There may be a possibility that we could do something with another organization within Burnsville, like the school district or others. But it is a very short period of time between now and the September 30th deadline. All I can tell you is that there's a 54-page notice of funding opportunity detailed document that we have to follow. And there's also several application processes that we have to go through for this particular grant. So staff would have to use some additional resources to apply for this grant. And then we would have to do some outreach to make sure that we meet all the criteria that is part of the evaluation and merit process that they go through to evaluate the awards of these grants. Anything below the $5 million mark for an award has to be, there there's a special application for justifying why you would apply for any funds under 5 million. I think we could come up with $5 million worth of opportunities. But if you recall, we submitted, when we were looking at options for ARPA funded projects, we had about $5 million in additional fiber optic
Yeah.
projects that we had identified during that process. So I would assume that we would go back to those items and try to leverage that as a potential in this process. It is a very tight timeline,
And a heavy lift from what I'm hearing from you.
one thing I would say, there are broadband grant funds and opportunities that come up frequently, either through the state Office of Broadband or the federal government, but this is a very significant one that has been released within the last year. And because of the dollar amount, it is a potentially missed opportunity if we don't try to do something with it.
I'd like to add on also that our school district 191, they're trying to decide what they're gonna do. 2024, their contracts are up with Comcast, and they're talking about whether they're gonna be able to partner with the city if we're gonna do something, or if they're gonna have to go on their own and do it, which is gonna increase their cost of doing business as they try to get things out for their students and as far as the fiber and broadband goes, so. I think there's opportunities with the school district for a partnership from talking to those folks lately.
Really, there's three key pieces to this grant, in that the city wouldn't be a service provider. We would just provide infrastructure to allow other service providers to deliver service to a anchor tenant organization like the school district.
Yeah.
And that's the differentiate. So you really have you have two other contact points. You have your partner that you're trying to build this out for, and those other service providers that hopefully would connect and utilize the infrastructure to do that. So that's assuming we would have a willing participants in that regard. And we may not in this process.
Yeah. But, you know, Tom, from the very beginning, we said that we would build infrastructure, but we don't deliver content. We stay out of the content role because there are other people who do that better than us. But we can build the infrastructure that delivers the
No.
service.
So I remember Cara going over some of these grant opportunities with us. And yes, county had said that this wasn't one they were interested in. Some of our cities, it appeared, had eligibility. But if I'm remembering correctly, I'm not sure that Burnsville fit the criteria, and we had a couple other cities that did not appear that they were fitting the criteria, because there was some legal definition of underserved that we were not hitting, because there was some type of percentage. And so that's why, as these came up, that's why DBB looked at it and then got scattered, because it did not appear that we could get everyone on board with it and, do it as a whole, because some of us did not meet eligibility. Perhaps she has that information still from when she went over it with us.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Schultz, to that point, under the evaluation and merits language of this particular grant, that is taken into consideration in the merit awards, in that you're eligible for more points in the merits
Right.
if you have more underserved or unserved areas within your community. But one of the other factors that they take into account is service providers, options, additional options for service providers.
Right.
So it's possible that you can still be awarded even if you don't have underserved areas, just based on the option for additional
Getting
competitive
multiple.
service providers within your community to improve the overall service and options. So that is a consideration, though. We may be eligible for less
Okay.
funds because of that, if we don't have as much underserved areas, but it doesn't preclude us from applying for the grant.
Oh, absolutely. No, I mean, if you have an opportunity at it, that's a good thing. But yeah, I know there was like a further, more in-depth write-up, and maybe that would help us speed our process going through it?
And I can review the information from many of those DVB meetings and see if I can
There's
find the
been a few.
reference
Yeah.
that you're
Yeah.
looking for.
So let me
Yeah.
understand, council direct staff to explore opportunities? Is that what I'm hearing?
I mean, time is of the essence on this one. It's due by September 30th.
I don't know, I'm just
It's out $5
listening.
million.
Well, I heard you say, Tom, it's an opportunity that we can take.
It's an opportunity.
It's an opportunity that definitely we can start, and if we run into a roadblock based on a criteria that we don't meet, then I'll be sure to bring that back to council and update the council, so we know that the process is either continues on or stops at that point for this particular grant.
Yeah.
That doesn't, again, preclude us from looking for other additional grant opportunities as they get
Yeah.
released through the
Yeah.
state or through the federal government at some future
Yeah.
point.
Okay, so Greg?
I asked that the council would just to be open to our feedback on that, right? I think
Absolutely.
Yes.
There are a number
Hey,
of hurdles here.
absolutely,
If we have to
absolutely.
tell you that we're stopping this one, happy to answer questions about that, but just know that that might be,
Well-
very well be the case.
I think that's absolutely fair.
That's fair.
is.
All the ask was tonight was,
To explore
Can we
this thing and
explore it?
Can we do it?
and so that's it, explore it. But also you need to take a look at everything that's on your plate. And, can we or can we not? But on a bigger picture, there are opportunities here for grants.
I'm hearing clear direction that Tom and I will get to work on exploring this. We will come back to you. I'm not going to plan on putting that in any sort of future discussion. I'll
No.
just keep you informed in our other communication channels.
Yeah.
So we'll be in touch on that in that regard, and just know that staff is also hearing your direction that grant management is important to the council, and we will continue to work in that direction,
Yeah.
both in the interim period and into the time where we actually would bring a grants position back in front of the council as the org analysis prescribes.
Good, okay. Anything else?
Yeah, I don't think there's any harm in looking for free money. I would just say with relating to this one, Tom, and I know you will, but if there's any, things that jump out at you as far as what would be required of us, that would be a liability, obviously. We'd want to know about that, but
Absolutely.
I don't think I even need to say that, so.
Okay,
We will be back to you with that information.
yeah, okay, very good.
Thank you.
If there's nothing else. Oh, is it? Oh, that's the 23rd. Oh, that's right, because we didn't have the other
Yes,
work
we didn't get the
session.
work session.
Okay, anybody has report? Kara, you have a report? Okay, then, Kay?
No, most of the committees are
Okay,
taking August off in many cases.
remind everybody, we have the Burnsville,
Oh, you want to make a
Festival.
public service announcement?
yeah.
You
We
want me
love
to?
those.
Yeah, just make the announcement. Oh, by the way, please let people know where they can sign up for the race, the Heart of the City race. Or is that not on this year?
HOTCrace.org.
Where?
You can, HOTC, Heart of the City acronym, race.org, has the registration link.
So,
It's happening.
because I was asked if they couldn't find it on the website for the Burnsville Festival.
I believe there's a link under the festivities, but I'll double check just to make sure.
Can
But
I do
HOTC race
it
has its
on
own.
a electric bike?
You can find the link on Art and all that jazz. It's
Question
on
in
there.
my world.
It is a hilly run. It's been highly respected as a very challenging 15K and a 10K course because of our hills. It's a great warm-up run for those participating in the Twin Cities Marathon. And we've had requests to go to 20K to help them train even more, which would be 2 loops of the 10K route.
So there is going to be a 20K?
No, we have a lot of requests from serious runners, and they're using the HOTC race as a warm-up for the Twin Cities
Yeah,
Marathon,
yeah,
and
yeah,
and
yeah.
they want something longer to help warm up even
Yeah.
more. And others have said, wow, the hills here, man, this is a tough 10 or
tough.
15K. So,
Yeah,
There's a lot of interest in it. Hopefully weather's great. It's been usually very good in the month of September here. It's one of the actually more appealing months of weather in the state of Minnesota. If you read about the weather by month, September is one of the most enviable. For the festival, we have probably the biggest announcement is we have a lot of new events. We have a new multicultural stage on Saturday from 1 to 7. We have a mariachi band. We have the Somali dance troupe. We have Chico Chavez Orchestra, and we have 6 artists from Chadwick Niles Phillips. I talked to him last night at Jack Cole Williams' going away party. He stepped away as executive director of the Twin Cities Catalyst Music. And there are 6 performers with a variety of talent, like folk and guitar and rock and rap and hip hop and spoken word. And so really going to be a very interesting lineup on Saturday from 1 to 7 at the Civic Center amphitheater stage that faces the hillside of the middle school. And then MBTA has stepped up and is providing a free shuttle. And one of the biggest complaints that people have had over the years with the festival in Fire Muster is there's no place to park. The church on Nicollet and 130th gets filled up, and then they start filling up on 130th, and then they go all the way back to Parkwood and down other streets and have to walk a long way to get to the main entrance coming off of Nicollet, and then there's a long walk to get to the festival. So we've eliminated all that hassle, especially for mobility challenge folks. The best thing to do is drive to the Burnsville Transit Station, park your car, a short walk, get on a wheelchair accessible bus, and they will drop you right in the heart of the action, right next to the food and the stage and all the good stuff and the merchants, and no hassle. And if you forget something in your car, you can just grab a bus and go back and come right back again, because the buses run frequently, every 15 minutes and more frequently during peak time. So it's going to be a hassle-free way to get to the festival and enjoy it Friday and Saturday. We open up the 4-day festival with the new revised, bigger than ever, block party on the plaza. We have 3 inflatables. We have brought in clowns making balloons, 2 face painters that we are providing. All kinds of kids' activities, a sensory-friendly zone for folks that need to maybe take a break from the intense action and noise and et cetera. We have a band on stage. Chico Chavez Orchestra is playing Wednesday night, and we're bringing them back to the multicultural stage, so they're going to play twice. And the night caps off with an 8 o'clock laser light show. So this is the block party of all block parties, even though the city's block party on the plaza, or not called block party, the party on the plaza, is a phenomenal event.
Yeah.
And the last one of the summer is coming up, I believe, this Thursday. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, this Thursday night.
Yeah.
So Amber has done such a great job bringing my grandson and granddaughter there. They love it. So block party in the plazas, we know how to do them in the city of Burnsville. And then Thursday night is the 8th of September. That is the craft beer tasting put on by Red Lion. There are 12 craft beers, best selection in the history of the craft beer tasting, and a car show. And we also have a band. Our old school 191 band, the faculty band from the high school, is going to play on the Nicollet Common stage for the entertainment of everybody. And we have, of course, all nights there's vendors, food vendors, and some merchant vendors provided. So going to be
both on
4
Wednesday
great
and
nights.
Thursday?
Wednesday and Thursday, music and vendors, and like Wednesday night is all about the family. Bring the kids out. That's going to be, I think school starts that Tuesday, so a couple days in school, and they'll have another chance to get out and have a lot of fun to end summer. And Wednesday night is all about families and kids, the block party in the plaza, and then a little more about adults coming out on Thursday night for the craft beer tasting, because you have to be 21, and then Friday and Saturday on the main festival grounds, just all kinds of exciting things. So the 2 big bands. Friday night is a 50-year favorite of the Twin Cities, Johnny Home Band. He drove the largest crowds in 2019 on a Friday night that the festival's ever seen, so we brought him back. He's going to be a crowd favorite. And then Saturday night we have Fleetwood Mac, and they are the only band, Fleetwood Mac tribute band, that is personally endorsed by Mickey Fleetwood. And if you want to go to fleetwoodmask.com, you can watch Mickey Fleetwood in a YouTube video really talk about Fleetwood Mac as the second coming of Fleetwood Mac. He just absolutely loves every aspect of the band, fully embodying the Fleetwood Mac theme and tradition and mood and music and everything. So voices are almost exact duplicates of the original band, which is something that I look for specifically. So very excited about our nighttime lineup, our daytime lineup on a multicultural stage. We have way more food. So this year, you won't have to wait in a 50-minute line to get any kind of food. We have plenty of food trucks this year. And of course, we have food trucks now also stationed on the other side of the carnival in our brand new Zombie Garage Zone youth area, where we have the Zombie Board Shop and our garage music coming together, putting on the coolest place you're going to be. If you're a teens or 20-something, you're going to want to be in the Zombie Garage Zone, listening to music, watching the skate competition, checking out all the fun prizes and demos and signings, and so that's going to go on from 4 o'clock until 7:30 or later, which it probably will, on Saturday. So lots of exciting things going on this year at the new Burnsville Festival.
And the parade is at what time?
Parade is 11 o'clock on Saturday the 10th. Starts off with a lot of fire trucks and then followed by the community parade. And Madam Mayor, to your point at our last meeting about getting a car, it's been about 6 or 7 years since the festival has provided cars. So call up your friends who have those really cool classic cars or convertible.
Okay,
and
good. When you said the last time when I asked, so I have a car.
Yeah. Great.
Okay, great.
Thank
Vince, thank you for that update. Vince?
Well, as the liaison to the fire muster, I'd like to remind everyone that the fire muster is coming up.
She looked at me, asked me, sorry. Well, you can talk about the finances and all that business stuff. I just talk
No,
about the
you
fun
don't
stuff.
have to report that to the people.
I'm easy, I got nothing.
Okay. Dan?
All that jazz was last Saturday, had a nice crowd. Like to see it a little bit bigger, but we're still rebuilding, so we'll be coming back next year with some new things. But everyone had a pretty good time. We had just one incident, and that was when the water fountain took off on front
But
of
it
the
was
stage.
only about, according to, wasn't it, was only 15 seconds?
Yeah. I mean, some kids hit the button wasn't totally disengaged. We took care of it, and it was no big deal. This Thursday at 2 o'clock is my THC workforce meeting with the League of Minnesota Cities. I think Hopkins has already passed a new ordinance, and I sent that to Greg to distribute out to all you guys, so you know what that looks like. And so hopefully we should be done either this week or the following month with that, to start bringing things for the cities to look at and for our legislators to look at as far as how they're gonna deal with how it's gonna work. And I've been around town, I've been going to a lot of the gummy dealers in town. They have different pricing too. But anyways, a lot of them like the law just the way it is. And then I would say to them, I understand that. Would you be okay if we had like 3 more CBD shops right next to you here? And they go, no. I said, well, that's what we're talking about, is how do we kind of regulate some of that stuff? So
Okay.
we'll go from there. I mean, I don't know where it's gonna come down.
Or maybe we should.
I mean, some cities outright banned it.
Are they gonna offer it at like health food stores like Valley
I have no
Natural?
idea. Right now, I
We
think you
don't
can
know.
I think you can do it anywhere, can't you?
As it is presently, anyone can sell it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
That's why
it
Dan
it
hangs out in the
absolutely
parking
could be
lot
in
for
a
a while.
health
Hanging
food
in the
store or
You can
a
make some
grocery
brownies
store.
and sell it.
As long as it's not more than 5%.
Well, I mean, there's discussions about a lot of these, like packaging and all these different things that have come up in this, and there's been talk about how people actually go to Colorado now and take the Colorado gummies and put them into Minnesota packaging and bring them back. And all kinds of weird things are going on, and so it'll settle out. I mean, our legislators are really gonna be the final decision on a whole lot of things, and a few cities have banned it, but most are not. They're walking through it and just trying to figure out how to kind of somewhat control it. So and we as a council have not had a discussion yet on that ourselves, and so I'm hoping that with the more information we get, that will be coming to us at some point soon.
Councilmember Gustafson, certainly to your point, the last time the council talked about this was, I believe it was a roundtable item when we first understood that the law was
Yeah.
included from the state. We will be back in front of you Michelle and her team have been working on this issue diligently across the organization. We'll be back to you at your September 13th work session. It's currently planned for more discussion. More to come on that.
Okay,
Okay,
so that's what's going on with that. With that, I'm done.
and I'm good. Greg, you have a report?
I do not.
Okay, Michelle? With all of that, we stand adjourned by acclamation. Thank you very much, everybody.